Hey everyone! Before we dive into tonight's story, if you're enjoying the content and want to help the channel grow, please consider using your hype points on this video. It genuinely helps more than you could possibly know and makes a massive difference in getting these stories out to more people. Also, if you're up for it, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from, whether you're winding down for the night or just starting your day. No pressure though, only if you want to share. Alright, let's get into tonight's investigation. The file sat in his hands like a live grenade. Evan Hartley had been working at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland for 8 months. It was June of 1998, a Thursday afternoon that had started like every other. The archive facility was a massive concrete structure that housed billions of documents, the collective memory of American government stretching back centuries. Hartley worked in Section 7, a climate-controlled vault 3 floors below ground level, where the most sensitive to classified materials were processed before being made available to researchers. His job was simple, if tedious: sort through newly declassified intelligence records, catalogue them according to the established system, and prepare them for public access. Box after box of Cold War-era documents, most of them mundane reports about Soviet grain production or diplomatic cable traffic. Some were fascinating glimpses into the machinery of espionage, but none of them had ever felt dangerous before. Until he opened the mislabeled Defense Intelligence Agency container, the box was one of 20 that had arrived that morning from a storage facility in Pennsylvania. Hartley had already processed 9 of them without incident. Standard wartime logistics documentation, exactly what the label promised. Requests for boots, fuel, ammunition, medicine, the mundane necessities of keeping an army in the field. But box number 10 was different. Inside, beneath 3 inches of actual supply requisitions that seemed authentic enough, was a folder that didn't belong. The folder itself was unremarkable, standard government issue manila, slightly yellowed with age, but the tab bore a label that made Hartley's pulse quicken. Paperclip-classified supplement-not for release. He set down his coffee cup and pulled the folder out carefully as if it might crumble at his touch. The weight felt wrong. Too heavy for just a few documents. His hands, he noticed, were trembling slightly. Everyone knew about Operation Paperclip. It was the famous program that brought German scientists to America after World War II, the one that gave us Werner von Braun and the space program. Hartley had processed paperclip documents before. They were fascinating historical artifacts, and most of them had been declassified, years ago. Researchers came from around the world to study them. But this was marked as classified, decades after most paperclip files had been opened to researchers, decades after the program itself had officially ended. The archive was quiet around him. The only sound was the low hum of the climate control system, and the occasional distant footstep from the hallway above. Hartley glanced toward the security camera in the corner of the room. Its red light blinked steadily, recording everything as always. He opened the folder carefully. The first item was a black and white photograph, slightly faded but clear enough. The edges were crisp, professionally developed. Government photography from the post-war period had a distinctive quality, and this matched it perfectly. The photo showed Werner von Braun, unmistakable with his sharp features and confident smile, standing in what appeared to be a military office. Von Braun wore civilian clothes, a dark suit and tie. Standing with him were 3 men in United States Army uniforms. 2 wore the insignia of colonels. The third, standing slightly apart from the others, wore captain's bars but no unit designation that Hartley could identify. But these weren't the officers usually photographed with von Braun. Hartley had seen hundreds of paperclip photographs during his months in the archives. He had studied the key figures, memorized their faces. These 3 men were completely unfamiliar. On the back of the photograph, written in pencil in a neat hand, Fort Strong Secure Facility, July 1947, Eclipse Preliminary Briefing. Hartley felt his mouth go dry. Fort Strong was a real place, an army installation in Massachusetts. but he had never encountered any reference to Eclipse in connection with Paperclip. The second item made his stomach tighten into a knot. It was a typed list on official War Department letterhead, dated August 1947. German names, 23 of them, each with a birth date and a field of specialisation listed beside them. Hartley ran his fingers down the list slowly. He recognised none of the names, not one, and he had studied the Paperclip rosters extensively. Every historian working on the programme used the same master lists, compiled from multiple sources over decades of research. These names appeared on none of them. The specialisations were unusual too, not rocket science or aeronautical engineering. Instead, he saw entries like neurological field manipulation, bioelectromagnetic interface systems, cognitive enhancement through external stimulation, psychotronic weapons development, non-local consciousness research. Beside each name was a handwritten notation in red ink: Cat 2 Specialist, Category 2. Hartley had never encountered that designation in any Paperclip documentation. The third document was a memorandum on Office of Strategic Services letterhead, dated October 21st, 1947. The header read, Project Eclipse, dash continuation protocols and security requirements. The text was brief, written in the clipped bureaucratic style of military intelligence. Eclipse researchers will continue where the Reich left off. Subjects must remain off record. Scientific potential outweighs public risk. Transfer to designated facilities to proceed under compartmentalized oversight. Category 2, specialists to remain separated from NASA track personnel at all times. No cross-program communication authorized. Standard Paperclip documentation procedures do not apply to Eclipse subjects. All records to be maintained separately from main Paperclip archive. Classification level to exceed top secret. Access restricted to need-to-know basis as determined by Oversight Committee. It was signed at the bottom in a strong angular hand. William J. Donovan, Major General, United States Army. Hartley felt his hands begin to shake. He set the memo down and stared at the signature. William Donovan, Wild Bill Donovan, the legendary spy chief, the man who had founded the Office of Strategic Services, America's first centralized intelligence agency, and led it through World War II. One of the most decorated soldiers in American history, a man who had won the Medal of Honor in World War I. But Donovan had retired from government service after the war. President Truman had disbanded the OSS in 1945, and Donovan had returned to his law practice in New York. Everyone knew that story. It was in every history book. So why was he signing classified memoranda about secret research programs in October of 1947? Hartley turned to the final page in the folder. It was a single sheet, heavier stock paper with text that had been stamped rather than typed. The stamps were in red ink, bold and unmistakable. Program status, terminated. Civilian access, prohibited. Research continuation, off-site. Classification level, permanent. Destruction of records, forbidden. Archive protocol, Eclipse vault only. The date stamp read, May 18th, 1953. Below the stamps, in the same handwriting as the October 47 memo, was a single sentence. Incident containment complete. All surviving personnel reassigned. Eclipse Continuity Division assumes oversight. Hartley sat back in his chair, his heart hammering against his ribs. The documents were spread before him on the sorting table, innocuous pieces of paper that seemed to pulse with hidden meaning. He knew he should take them to his supervisor. Protocol was clear. Anything unusual, anything that seemed misclassified or particularly sensitive, went through proper channels. That was the rule. But something stopped him. Some instinct, some voice in the back of his mind that whispered, "Once you hand this over, you'll never see it again. No one will. These documents will disappear, and it will be as if they never existed." The thought made him feel paranoid, which bothered him. Hartley prided himself on being rational, methodical. He wasn't prone to conspiracy thinking. He trusted the system, trusted the process. That was why he had taken this job in the first place. But the documents in front of him didn't feel like history. They felt like something alive, something dangerous, something that people might kill to keep hidden. He was still debating what to do, his mind racing through possibilities, when he heard the door to the archive room open behind him. Hartley jumped, his hand instinctively moving to cover the documents. He turned in his chair. 2 men entered. They wore dark suits, conservative cuts, nothing flashy. White shirts, dark ties. Their shoes were polished to a mirror shine. One was older, perhaps in his late 50s, with grey at the temples and the kind of posture that came from a lifetime in military or government service. His face was weathered but expressionless, eyes that took in everything without revealing anything. The other was younger, perhaps 30, athletic and alert. He moved with the controlled grace of someone trained in hand-to-hand combat. His eyes scanned the room with professional efficiency, noting exits, angles, positioning. They didn't belong here. Hartley had worked in the archives long enough to recognise the types who came through. Historians, researchers, journalists, sometimes military personnel following up on specific records. These men were something else. "Mr. Hartley," the older man said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, delivered in a flat tone that expected no response. Hartley felt his throat tighten. "Yes? We need to collect some materials that were incorrectly included in your batch today." The man's eyes went to the folder on the table, to the document spread beside it. That one, specifically, and any others from the same container. His voice was calm, professional, but there was something underneath it. Not quite a threat, but an absolute certainty. The voice of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Hartley felt his throat go dry. His mind raced. "Who are you? I need to see authorization before I can release any materials." "Office of Special Investigations." The older man produced a credentials wallet from his inner jacket pocket, flipped it open with practiced ease. The badge looked legitimate, the photo matched his face. The younger man did the same, but Hartley barely looked at them. His eyes were fixed on the younger man, who had moved with subtle efficiency to flank the sorting table, positioning himself between Hartley and the door. The movement had been casual, almost invisible, but its purpose was clear. "This folder was in a declassified container," Hartley said, hearing the tremor in his own voice and hating it. "It was marked for public release. According to the transfer documentation, everything in that box has been through proper review channels. It's part of the public record now." "No," the older man said simply. His tone didn't change. "It's not." He stepped forward and reached for the folder. Hartley's hand moved instinctively to stop him, but something in the man's eyes made him freeze. It was like looking into the eyes of a predator, calm, patient, but absolutely ready to act. The older man gathered the documents with practiced efficiency, sliding them back into the folder in the same order Hartley had found them. The photograph, the list, the memo, the final page. His movements were careful, respectful of the materials, but completely confident. This was not the first time he had retrieved classified documents. "You never saw this file," the man said, looking directly into Hartley's eyes. The folder disappeared into his briefcase with a soft click of the latch. "Do you understand me? You never saw it. It was never in that box. This conversation never happened." Hartley wanted to protest, wanted to assert his rights as an archivist, as a federal employee, as a citizen. He wanted to demand proper documentation, to insist on following protocols. He wanted to ask 100 questions about what those documents meant, why they were classified, what Project Eclipse had been. But the look in the man's eyes stopped him cold. This was not a request. This was not a negotiation. This was a statement of fact, delivered with the weight of authority that came from somewhere far above the pay grade of a junior archivist. "I understand," Hartley heard himself say. His voice sounded distant to his own ears, as if someone else was speaking. The older man nodded once, a brief acknowledgement. Then he turned to his companion. "Check the box. Make sure there's nothing else." The younger man moved to the container Hartley had been processing. He lifted out the remaining supply requisitions with quick, expert hands, checking each page before setting it aside. His movements were methodical, thorough. He found nothing else unusual. "Clear," he said. The older man looked back at Hartley one final time. "You seem like a smart man, Mr. Hartley. Smart enough to understand that some things are classified for good reasons. Some things need to stay buried. Not because anyone did anything wrong, but because the alternative would be worse. Do you understand what I'm saying?" Hartley nodded. He wasn't sure he did understand, but nodding seemed like the safest response. "Good." The man's expression softened almost imperceptibly. Not quite a smile, but something less threatening. "Go back to your work. Finish processing the rest of these boxes. Nothing unusual happened today. You found exactly what you expected to find. Supply requisitions from the European theatre. Nothing more." The two men left without another word. The door closed behind them with a soft click that somehow sounded final, like a vault sealing shut. Hartley sat alone in the archive room for a long time after they were gone. The table in front of him was empty now, just. The ordinary supply requisitions spread across its surface. The folder was gone. The photograph, the list, the memo, the termination order, all of it gone as if it had never existed. His hands were still shaking. He noticed that his coffee had gone cold, a film forming across the surface. The security camera in the corner continued its steady blinking, recording an empty room where nothing unusual had happened. Nothing at all. Hartley looked at his watch. 3:17 in the afternoon. He still had 2 hours left in his shift, 9 more boxes to process. He pulled the next container toward him and opened it mechanically. More supply requisitions, boots and fuel and ammunition, the mundane logistics of war, nothing unusual, nothing dangerous. He never told anyone what he had seen that day, not his supervisor, who asked at the end of the shift if everything had gone smoothly, not his colleagues during lunch breaks, not his wife when he got home that evening and she asked about his day. He finished his shift, checked out at the security desk, drove home through the late afternoon traffic of suburban Maryland and tried to forget. But he never did forget. The documents haunted him, the names on that list, the strange specializations, Project Eclipse, the signature of a dead man on documents that should not exist. And 20 years later, when he was finally old enough and angry enough and brave enough to break his silence, he would tell his story to a researcher investigating Operation Paperclip, and he would add one final detail that he had noticed in that brief, terrible moment before the documents disappeared. The older man who had taken the folder had a name tag on his briefcase, one of those leather luggage tags that people use when travelling, just visible for a moment as he closed it and prepared to leave. It read, Eclipse Continuity Division, Act 1, The History They Admit. To understand what Evan Hartley may have stumbled upon in that archive room in June of 1998, we need to start with what we know for certain, the acknowledged history, the version that sits in textbooks and documentaries, the story that has been told and retold until it feels like settled fact. In May of 1945, Nazi Germany collapsed. The Third Reich, which Hitler had promised would last 1,000 years, had endured for exactly 12 years and 4 months. As Allied forces swept through German territory in the final weeks of the war, they discovered something that would change the course of the 20th century. The Nazis had been far ahead of everyone else in certain areas of scientific research. Jet engines that could propel aircraft at unprecedented speeds, ballistic missiles that could strike targets hundreds of miles away, rocket technology that pointed toward the stars, advanced aeronautics that made Allied aircraft look primitive by comparison. The V-2 rocket, which had rained terror on London and Antwerp in the final year of the war, represented a quantum leap in engineering. Standing nearly 50 feet tall and weighing over 28,000 pounds at launch, it could carry a 1-ton warhead across a distance of 200 miles, faster than the speed of sound, striking without warning from the edge of space itself. It was the world's first ballistic missile, and the Allies had nothing remotely like it. The Germans had also made advances in fields ranging from synthetic fuels to infrared optics to wind tunnel design. Some of this was practical engineering that could immediately be applied to military and civilian purposes. Some of it was theoretical work that would take years to fully understand and implement. And the scientists who had built all of this were now up for grabs. The United States Army began a frantic operation to locate and secure German scientists before the Soviets could get to them. Special intelligence teams, organised under a program initially called Operation Overcast, fanned out across occupied Germany. They followed leads from captured documents, interviewed prisoners of war, tracked down research facilities that had been hastily abandoned in the final chaos of the Nazi collapse. They found treasures beyond imagination, hidden laboratories carved into mountains, underground factories where slave labourers had assembled rockets while bombs fell overhead, filing cabinets stuffed with technical drawings and experimental data, and scientists, hundreds of them, eager to trade their expertise for safety in America or Britain, or anywhere that wasn't controlled by the advancing Soviet forces. The Soviets were conducting their own parallel operation, of course. The race was on. Whoever could secure the most German scientific talent would have an enormous advantage in the emerging Cold War. Both sides understood this with crystal clarity. In July of 1945, President Harry Truman signed off on what would eventually become Operation Paperclip. The name, chosen later, came from the paperclips that were used to attach new documentation to the scientists' files. Documentation that would help them enter the United States despite their Nazi backgrounds. Documentation that would, in many cases, obscure or outright lie about what they had done during the war. The official program would eventually bring approximately 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians to America over the next decade. Some came immediately in the chaotic aftermath of surrender. Others were recruited more carefully, their backgrounds vetted, their value assessed. By the mid-1950s, they were scattered across the United States, working at military facilities, research laboratories, and the newly formed space agency. The most famous among them, the face of the program in the public imagination, was Wernher von Braun. Von Braun had been the technical director of the German rocket program at Peenemünde, on the Baltic coast. He had led the team that designed the V2, shepherding it from theoretical concept to operational weapon in just a few years despite constant resource shortages and Allied bombing. He was brilliant, charismatic, and ruthlessly pragmatic. When it became clear that Germany would lose the war, he made careful preparations to ensure that he and his key team members would surrender to the Americans, not the Soviets. He got his wish. In May of 1945, von Braun and more than 400 of his colleagues surrendered to American forces in Bavaria. They brought with them truckloads of documents and 14 tons of V2 components that they had hidden in a mine shaft. And in return, America got the foundation of its space program. The story of what happened next has been told many times. Von Braun and his team were brought to Fort Bliss, Texas, and later to Huntsville, Alabama. They taught American engineers everything they knew about rocketry. They redesigned and improved their V2. They developed new concepts. They dreamed of missions to Mars while building weapons for the Cold War. Von Braun would go on to design the Redstone rocket, which put America's first satellite into orbit. He would lead the development of the Saturn V, the massive 3-stage rocket that remains the most powerful machine ever successfully operated by humans. He would become the public face of American space exploration, appearing on television with Walt Disney, meeting with presidents, embodying the promise of American technological supremacy. When Neil Armstrong stepped onto the lunar surface on July 20th, 1969, he did so on technology built by former members of the Nazi rocket program. The Saturn V that lifted Apollo 11 toward the moon had been designed under von Braun's leadership. The trajectory calculations, the staging procedures, the engine designs, all of it bore the fingerprints of Peenemünde. Other paperclip scientists made equally important contributions, if less publicly celebrated. Hermann Oberth, one of the founding fathers of rocketry whose theoretical work had inspired both von Braun and the Soviet program, came to America and continued his research. Arthur Rudolph, who had overseen V2 production at the underground Mittelwerk factory, where thousands of slave labourers died, became a key figure in the Saturn program and received NASA's highest honour. Kurt Debus, who had managed rocket launches for the German military, and had been an active member of the SS, became the first director of Kennedy Space Center. Hubertus Strughold, whose work in aviation medicine had pushed the boundaries of human endurance in high-altitude flight, helped develop the protocols that would keep astronauts alive in the hostile environment of space. These men, and hundreds of others like them, formed the backbone of American aerospace achievement in the 50s and 60s. They trained a generation of American engineers. They solved problems that had seemed insurmountable. They turned science fiction into science fact. This is the story everyone knows. The story of redemption through science. The story of brilliant minds rescued from a fallen regime and given a second chance to serve humanity, to achieve the dreams that politics and war had interrupted. It's a compelling narrative. It's even mostly true, but it's not the whole truth. Because President Truman's order authorizing Operation Paperclip had included one explicit restriction, written in clear language that seemed to leave no room for interpretation. No one who had been involved in war crimes would be allowed entry to the United States. Active participants in Nazi atrocities, those who had ordered or overseen or participated in the horrors of the concentration camps, or the slave labour programs, or the medical experiments, these people would not be given safe harbour on American soil. On paper, this restriction was absolute and non-negotiable. In practice, it was routinely and systematically ignored. Dozens of the scientists brought to America under Paperclip had records connecting them directly to war crimes. Some had been members of the SS, Hitler's elite paramilitary organisation, responsible for some of the worst atrocities of the Nazi regime. Others had held rank in the Nazi Party itself. Still others had overseen slave labour operations where prisoners from concentration camps were worked to death building rockets and jet engines. Arthur Rudolph's Mittelwerk factory was a hell on earth, a subterranean nightmare where emaciated prisoners assembled V-2 rockets while guards beat them for working too slowly. More prisoners died building the V-2 than died from the weapons use against Allied cities. Rudolph oversaw it all, making production decisions that he knew would cost lives, meeting quotas that could only be achieved through slave labour. Hubertus Strughold conducted aviation medicine experiments that pushed human subjects to the limits of endurance and beyond. Some of his research had used data from Nazi experiments on concentration camp prisoners, experiments where subjects were frozen to death or killed in pressure chambers. Kurt de Boos had been an active and enthusiastic member of the Nazi Party and the SS. He had worn the uniform, attended the rallies, believed in the ideology. United States intelligence agencies, faced with the reality that the scientists most valuable to America's national security interests often had the most compromised backgrounds, simply rewrote their files. Incriminating documentation was removed or destroyed. Memberships in Nazi organizations were erased from the record. War crimes were attributed to others or dismissed as exaggerations. Clean histories were fabricated, complete with forged documents and coached testimony. The men came to America with pristine records, their past buried in classified archives, their crimes erased from official history. This is acknowledged fact now, not conspiracy theory. Declassified documents have confirmed it in exhaustive detail. Congressional investigations have exposed it. Journalists have written books about it. It remains controversial, a source of ongoing moral debate, but it's no longer secret. The question is asked again and again, should America have done this? Should we have given safe harbour to men who served Hitler, who used slave labour, who participated in the machinery of genocide? Should we have built our space program, our missile defence, our technological supremacy, on the backs of people who committed atrocities? These are important questions. They deserve serious consideration. The ethical compromise at the heart of Operation Paperclip is real and troubling. But perhaps the controversy focuses our attention in the wrong direction. Perhaps the debate about whether we should have brought Nazi scientists to America distracts us from a deeper, darker question. What if some of the Paperclip scientists weren't brought to America for the space program at all? What if there was a second track, running parallel to the public program? A shadow operation that never appeared in any official roster? Scientists whose work was too sensitive, too disturbing, too potentially explosive to ever be acknowledged? What if the 1,600 names we know about were just the surface? the acceptable face of a program that went much deeper. What if Evan Hartley really did find evidence of this in 1998, buried in a mislabeled box where it was never supposed to be found? And what if the reason those two men arrived so quickly, knew exactly what they were looking for, and removed it with such practiced efficiency was because this has happened before? Because there are people whose full-time job is to find these accidental exposures and make them disappear. Act 2. The specialists who don't exist. The first hint that Operation Paperclip might have been larger and stranger than the official history admits appears in declassified State Department cables from the late 1940s and early 50s. These documents, released piecemeal over decades in response to Freedom of Information Act requests, contain occasional references to something that shouldn't exist according to every published history of the program. They mention Category 2 paperclip specialists. The references are brief, usually just a line or two embedded in longer documents about other matters. A budget allocation for Category 2 specialists requiring special security clearances, a transfer order for Category 2 personnel moving between facilities, a request for additional housing at a military installation to accommodate incoming Cat 2 researchers. But nowhere in any public paperclip documentation, in any of the comprehensive rosters compiled by historians over decades of research, does the term Category 2 appear with any definition or explanation. The official paperclip rosters are remarkably complete. They contain approximately 1,600 names, each with an associated biography compiled from multiple sources: Nazi-era records, American military intelligence files, personnel documents from the various facilities where the scientists worked, immigration records, and in many cases interviews with the scientists themselves or their surviving family members. Each entry includes a birth date, place of birth, educational background, field of expertise, the German institution where they worked during the war, the American facility where they were first assigned, and a brief summary of their subsequent career. The rosters are cross-referenced, footnoted, and have been scrutinized by multiple researchers. They represent decades of painstaking historical work. None of these rosters mention a Category 2 designation. The scientists are all treated as part of a single program, with variations in security clearance and assignment, but no fundamental subdivision into separate categories. So who are these people mentioned in the State Department cables? A handful of researchers working on the margins of mainstream historical inquiry have attempted to track down the answer. What they've found is fragmentary, contradictory, and deeply strange. The pieces don't quite fit together, and there are enormous gaps where records should be but aren't. The Category 2 specialists, according to these scattered references, worked in fields that didn't fit the public narrative of Operation Paperclip. They weren't rocket scientists developing the next generation of missiles. They weren't aeronautical engineers designing swept-wing jet aircraft. They weren't chemists working on synthetic fuels, or physicists working on nuclear weapons. Their specializations, where they can be identified at all, included fields that sound more like science fiction than legitimate research: human sensory manipulation and control, electromagnetic behavioral research and modification, high-altitude survival experiments involving extreme conditions, neurological interference technology, cognitive enhancement through external stimulation protocols, psychotronic weapons development and field testing, non-local consciousness research and application. These are not the kind of specializations that help you build a rocket to the moon. These are the kind of specializations that suggest research into controlling human beings, influencing thoughts, manipulating perceptions, overriding will and choice. And according to the fragmentary records that mention them, these Category 2 specialists were not sent to NASA facilities or aerospace research centres. They went to military installations with higher security classifications, Department of Defense research laboratories that didn't appear on organisational charts, sites that had cover stories explaining their official purpose, while the real work happened in locked wings that required additional clearances. One location appears with unusual frequency in the scattered references that mention Category 2 specialists, a place called Camp King. Camp King was a real facility, and its history is not entirely secret. It sat in the Taunus Mountains near Frankfurt, Germany, occupying the grounds of a former Prussian military academy. During the American occupation of Germany after World War II, it served as a United States military intelligence site. The official cover was that Camp King handled routine intelligence processing, document analysis, debriefing of prisoners, coordination with other Allied intelligence services. Administrative work, basically, the kind of thing that any occupation force needs. But Camp King's real purpose was considerably darker. Under programs with anodyne code names like Bluebird and Artichoke, which would eventually merge into the infamous MK Ultra, the CIA conducted interrogation experiments at Camp King. They tested drugs on prisoners. They developed psychological techniques meant to break resistance. They explored methods of extracting information through means that went far beyond conventional questioning. The experiments conducted at Camp King in the late 1940s and early 50s would later be described in congressional testimony as torture. Prisoners were kept in isolation for weeks. They were subjected to sensory deprivation. They were dosed with experimental compounds that we now know caused permanent psychological damage. Some died, most were damaged, none consented. This is not conspiracy theory. This is documented historical fact, confirmed by declassified CIA documents and congressional investigations. But there's one detail about Camp King that has never been fully explained. A declassified memorandum from February 1950, written by a CIA officer stationed at Camp King, mentions that Paperclip researchers were assisting with interrogation enhancement work at the facility. The memo discusses scheduling difficulties, security protocols for the research staff, and requests for additional laboratory equipment. But the names of those Paperclip researchers remain redacted in every released version of the document. Black bars cover their identities, their backgrounds, their specializations, their German affiliations, all of it hidden behind classification that has never been lifted. Who were they? What were they doing? What expertise could they possibly bring to interrogation research that the CIA couldn't develop on its own? The official answer, repeated in every response to Freedom of Information Act requests that have tried to uncover these names, is that the information remains classified for national security reasons. The identity of intelligence personnel, even personnel from programs that ended decades ago, cannot be revealed. But that explanation doesn't quite make sense. Thousands of CIA personnel from that era have been identified in declassified documents. Names of case officers, station chiefs, technical specialists, all released without apparent concern for national security. The names of Paperclip scientists working on rockets and jet engines were never classified in the first place. So why do these particular names remain hidden? One theory, advanced by researchers who have spent years trying to piece together the fragments, is that these weren't ordinary Paperclip scientists at all. They were the Category 2 specialists, people whose backgrounds were too sensitive to ever be revealed, because revealing them would expose the true nature of the program. Because if the official Paperclip scientist had been involved in conventional war crimes, slave labour and weapons development, what had the Category 2 specialists been involved in? There's a pattern in the fragmentary evidence, a suggestion of purpose that emerges when you lay all the pieces side by side. These specialists weren't just helping with conventional interrogation techniques. They were bringing something new to the table, something that the Nazi regime had been developing in its final years as the war turned against them and desperate men pursued desperate measures. The Nazis had conducted extensive research into what we would now call psychological warfare and behavioural manipulation. Some of this was crude propaganda, the kind of thing any government does. But some of it went deeper, into experimental territory that combined genuine scientific research with pseudoscience and occultism. Experiments in hypnosis and suggestion. Research into the effects of electromagnetic fields on human nervous systems. Attempts to use drugs and sensory manipulation to create programmable soldiers. Wild theories about psychic influence and thought control. Most of it was garbage, the product of ideological thinking divorced from scientific method. But some of it, according to reports that filtered back to Allied intelligence during and after the war, had produced results. Unexpected results. Results that suggested it might be possible to influence human behaviour through means other than conventional persuasion or physical force. And if Operation Paperclip was fundamentally about capturing German scientific expertise before the Soviets could get it, then these specialists would have been among the highest priority targets, not for their ability to build weapons that could destroy cities, but for their ability to build tools that could control minds. The documents that Evan Hartley saw in 1998, if they were authentic, suggested exactly this: a parallel program hidden within the larger Paperclip operation, bringing scientists whose work could never be acknowledged to facilities where they could continue research that could never be revealed. Research into the human mind, into consciousness and perception, into the possibility of overriding free will itself, and if that research succeeded, even partially, then the implications are staggering. Because it would mean that somewhere in the classified history of American intelligence, hidden in archives that civilians like Hartley would never normally access, there's evidence that we learned how to manipulate human thought and behaviour in ways that go beyond anything the public has been told. It would mean that the real breakthrough from Operation Paperclip wasn't the Saturn V rocket. It was something far more dangerous. Act 3. Project Eclipse. The memorandum that Evan Hartley saw in that archive room in June of 1998, the one that two men from the Office of Special Investigations arrived to confiscate within hours of his discovery, contained a designation that appears nowhere in any declassified government records: Project Eclipse. No program by that name shows up in budget documents from the late 40s and early 50s. No personnel rosters, no facility assignments, no after-action reports or progress updates, no congressional testimony mentions it. No presidential finding acknowledges its existence. If it existed, it was buried deeper than anything that has been revealed in the decades of investigations and exposures that have gradually pulled back the curtain on Cold War-era intelligence operations. But the date on that memorandum, if Hartley's memory is accurate, is significant. October 21st, 1947. That was a pivotal moment in American intelligence history, a hinge point where multiple storylines converged. 3 months earlier, in July of 1947, something had crashed in the desert near Roswell, New Mexico. The official explanation was a weather balloon, part of a classified project to detect Soviet nuclear tests. The alternative explanation became the cornerstone of UFO conspiracy theory. But regardless of what actually happened at Roswell, the incident triggered a wave of interest in unconventional phenomena within the military and intelligence communities. Suddenly, questions that had seemed like science fiction were being taken seriously at the highest levels. In September of 1947, the National Security Act was signed into law, fundamentally reorganizing American intelligence operations for the emerging Cold War. The Act created the CIA, consolidated military intelligence services, and established the National Security Council. It represented a recognition that the United States needed permanent intelligence capabilities, not just wartime expedients. And if Hartley's document was real, then in October of 1947, someone was signing memoranda about continuing research where the Reich left off, about maintaining subjects off the record, about scientific potential outweighing public risk. The signature on that memo was supposedly Major General William J. Donovan. Donovan was a genuine American legend, a figure whose career seemed too dramatic to be real. He had won the Medal of Honor in World War I for leading his battalion through withering German machine gun fire, earning the nickname Wild Bill for his courage under fire. Between the wars, he had practiced law in New York and travelled extensively, developing connections with foreign intelligence services and thinking about how America might need to conduct espionage in a future conflict. When World War II began, Donovan lobbied President Roosevelt to create a centralized intelligence agency. Roosevelt agreed, and in July 1941, the Office of Strategic Services was born with Donovan at its head. He led the OSS through 4 years of war, building an organization from nothing into an effective intelligence service that conducted espionage, sabotage, psychological warfare, and covert operations across multiple theatres. The OSS's achievements were real and significant. It had recruited Nazi defectors, supported resistance movements behind enemy lines, conducted daring operations that saved American lives. Donovan had built something impressive, but when the war ended, President Truman disbanded the OSS. Truman was suspicious of intelligence services, worried about creating an American Gestapo. He wanted military intelligence to return to the military services and civilian intelligence to be handled by the State Department and FBI. Donovan argued against this decision, warning that America would need coordinated intelligence capabilities in the peace that would follow. But Truman's mind was made up. In October 1945, the OSS ceased to exist. Donovan, disappointed and pushed aside, returned to his law practice in New York. That's the official story, the one in every biography and history book. Donovan retired from intelligence work, practiced law, gave occasional speeches about national security issues, but held no official position in the government after 1945. So why would he be signing classified memoranda about secret research programs in October of 1947? The simple answer is that he wouldn't. The document must be a forgery, someone trying to lend authenticity to a hoax by using the name of a famous intelligence figure. But there's a more complicated answer, one that researchers who have studied Donovan's post-war activities have uncovered. Donovan may have been officially retired, but he remained deeply connected to intelligence circles. He advised government officials on security matters. He maintained close relationships with former OSS personnel who had moved into the State Department, the military intelligence services, and eventually the CIA. He worked on classified projects through back channels, operating in the shadows without official title or acknowledgement. Donovan believed in the necessity of intelligence work, in the hard choices that had to be made to keep America safe. He was pragmatic about means and ends. He had ordered operations during the war that violated conventional morality because he believed they served a greater good. He had recruited people with compromised backgrounds, made deals with criminals and collaborators, overlooked ethical lines because winning the war mattered more than maintaining purity. If someone needed to run a program that was too sensitive even for normal classified channels, someone who would ask the right questions without worrying too much about the answers, Donovan would be exactly the kind of person you'd bring in. Someone with experience, connections, and a willingness to operate in moral grey areas. Someone who could make things happen without leaving official fingerprints. Someone who understood that some secrets need to stay secret forever. The memorandum that Hartley saw mentioned designated facilities where the Eclipse researchers would continue their work, separated from the main Paperclip operation and hidden under deeper classification. Fragmentary evidence from Freedom of Information Act requests and occasional witness accounts suggest several possibilities. Wright Field in Ohio, which later became Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, was a centre for aerospace research and development. It was also, according to persistent rumours, a repository for unusual materials and classified projects that didn't fit elsewhere in the military structure. The base was enormous, with hundreds of buildings spread across thousands of acres. It would be relatively easy to conduct sensitive research in one corner without anyone else knowing. Fort Detrick in Maryland was officially established as a biological warfare research centre in 1943. Its secure laboratories and isolation from public scrutiny made it an ideal location for sensitive experiments of any kind. If you needed to study things that most people would find disturbing, Fort Detrick offered both the facilities and the security to do it without observation. Brookhaven National Laboratory on Long Island was created in 1947, supposedly to conduct research into peaceful uses of nuclear energy. But its government funding, extensive security measures, and remote location could have covered work that had nothing to do with nuclear physics. And there are hints, buried in various documents and testimonies collected over the years, of an unlisted facility somewhere near Los Alamos, New Mexico. The Manhattan Project had established multiple secret sites around Los Alamos, some of which continued operating after the war under cover of nuclear weapons research. One of these sites, never officially acknowledged, may have hosted research that had nothing to do with atomic bombs. According to the conspiracy theory built from these fragments, Project Eclipse was focused on continuing and extending research that the Nazis had begun. Psychotronic weapons research. The idea was that electromagnetic fields, properly tuned and directed, could influence human nervous systems at a distance, make people feel fear or confusion, disrupt their ability to think clearly, perhaps even implant suggestions or commands, cognitive behaviour alteration through chemical and psychological means, finding combinations of drugs, hypnosis, and conditioning that could reshape how people think and perceive reality. Not crude brainwashing, but something more subtle and effective. Rapid learning induction, techniques for implanting information or skills directly into the brain, bypassing normal learning processes. The implications for military training would be enormous. Neurological dominance strategies, methods for overriding human will and decision-making, for making people carry out actions against their own interests without consciously recognising what was being done to them. Some of this sounds like pure science fiction, the kind of thing you'd see in a B-movie from the 50s, but research into these areas was very real during the Cold War, and some of it produced results that we're still trying to understand. The CIA's MKUltra program, which has been thoroughly documented through declassified records and congressional testimony, explored many of these same concepts. Between 1953 and 1973, MKUltra conducted hundreds of experiments on unwitting subjects. They dosed people with LSD and other psychoactive drugs, often without the subjects knowing. They researched hypnosis and suggestion. They explored sensory deprivation and psychological manipulation. They sought methods of mind control that could be used against enemy agents, prisoners, or anyone else who needed to be controlled. The programme's excesses were finally exposed in the 1970s during the Church Committee hearings, a series of congressional investigations into intelligence abuses. The testimony shocked the nation. CIA Director Richard Helms formally apologised. Reforms were implemented, files were declassified and made public. But the conspiracy theory surrounding Project Eclipse suggests something more disturbing. MKUltra wasn't the beginning of this research. It was the continuation. Or perhaps more accurately, it was the public-facing version. The program that could be acknowledged if anyone asked too many questions, while the real research continued elsewhere under deeper cover. Eclipse, according to this theory, had started earlier, in the immediate aftermath of World War II. It had recruited the Category 2 paperclip specialists, who knew things that mainstream science hadn't discovered. It had given them facilities, funding, and subjects to experiment on. And it had achieved results that MKUltra scientists would spend decades trying to replicate. Then, something had gone wrong. An incident in May of 1953, catastrophic enough to force the programme's termination. At least the termination of Eclipse as it had existed up to that point. But the research didn't stop. It was reorganised, compartmentalised, hidden, under different names and different budget lines. Some of it may have been folded into MKUltra. Some may have continued under the Eclipse Continuity division that Hartley saw mentioned on that briefcase. Continuity. Not closure, not completion. Continuity. As if the programme hadn't ended at all. As if it had simply gone deeper underground. Act 4. The Scientist with No Name. Among the fragmentary references to Category 2 paperclip specialists scattered across decades of partially declassified documents, one designation appears with unusual and troubling frequency. Researcher 47. Not a name, not even initials that might be cross-referenced against other records, just a number, stark and impersonal. Researcher 47 appears in classified budget documents from 1948, in facility transfer orders from 1949 and 1950. In what appear to be progress reports from 1951 and 52. His designation is always the same, never a name, always just the number. His field is listed variously, depending on which document you're looking at, as bioelectromagnetic interface systems, non-local cognition research, field-based neurological manipulation, and in one particularly cryptic entry, simply consciousness alteration through resonance protocols. These are not standard scientific disciplines. They don't correspond to any recognised academic department or research specialty. They sound more like concepts from science fiction than legitimate areas of inquiry. but the documents treat them as real, with funding allocations measured in tens of thousands of 1940s dollars, progress reports detailing experimental results, and security classifications that exceeded normal top-secret designations. The strange thing about Researcher 47, the detail that makes him different from every other scientist associated with Operation Paperclip, is that he seems to have no background, no history before appearing in American custody in 1947. Every other Paperclip scientist, including even the Category 2 specialists where their names can be partially uncovered through research, has some kind of paper trail in Germany. University records showing where they earned their degrees, publications in scientific journals even if the journals were obscure, patent applications for their inventions, military service records from the Wehrmacht or Luftwaffe, membership records from Nazi party organisations or professional societies. The Nazis were meticulous record keepers, maintaining detailed documentation on millions of people, and the Allied intelligence teams that swept through Germany in the months after surrender were equally thorough in documenting what they found. They photographed everything. They seized every archive they could locate. They interviewed thousands of people, but Researcher 47 has no German records, no birth certificate from any German municipality, no university enrolment at any German institution, no publication history in any German scientific journal, no military service record, even though virtually every German man of his generation would have been involved in military service or war work in some capacity. It's as if he didn't exist before appearing in American custody. Researchers who have tried to track down his identity have generated several theories to explain this absence. Perhaps his records were deliberately destroyed by the Germans before surrender, part of a last-minute effort to conceal the most sensitive programs. Perhaps he worked for one of the Nazi research programs so secret that they kept no formal documentation that might fall into enemy hands. Perhaps he was recruited from occupied territory outside Germany itself, from Poland or Czechoslovakia or Austria, and was given a German designation for administrative convenience. Or perhaps he was never German at all. This last possibility is the most disturbing, because it suggests something else entirely. Something that would explain why his records are sealed more tightly than any other aspect of the program. If Researcher 47 wasn't a captured Nazi scientist, then what was he? One theory, advanced by researchers who have spent years studying the fragments and anomalies in the Paperclip records, is that he was a joint creation. Not a person brought from Germany, but someone whose identity was manufactured by the program itself. A test subject who became a researcher. Someone whose background was erased deliberately because revealing it would expose the true nature of what was being done. The theory suggests that the Nazi scientists brought to America weren't just conducting research, they were conducting it on American subjects. Military personnel, perhaps, volunteers who didn't fully understand what they were volunteering for, or prisoners, people whose absence wouldn't be noticed or investigated, or patients from mental institutions, people who could be experimented on without consent because their testimony would never be believed. And perhaps one of those subjects turned out to be particularly receptive to whatever was being done, particularly talented at the skills being developed, so talented that he became part of the research team himself, his origins obscured behind a number designation, because the truth would be too explosive to ever acknowledge. This sounds paranoid. It sounds like conspiracy thinking taken to an extreme. But the history of classified research programs includes many instances where ethical violations that seemed unthinkable were later revealed to be real. The Tuskegee syphilis experiment, where black men were denied treatment for decades so researchers could study the disease's progression. Project MKUltra's dosing of unwitting Americans with LSD and other drugs. The CIA's operation of secret prisons where torture was routine and documented. Is it really so impossible that a program buried deeper than any of these, hidden behind multiple layers of classification and deniability, might have crossed even more fundamental ethical lines? The final reference to Researcher 47 appears in a CIA memorandum from May 1953. The memo, partially declassified in 1987 with significant redactions, describes what it calls an uncontrolled field resonance test resulting in personnel loss. The language is bureaucratic, almost antiseptic, the kind of careful phrasing that government agencies use when describing disasters they don't want to take responsibility for. But the implications are clear enough. Something went catastrophically wrong during an experiment. The memo includes a list of names, scientists who died in the incident, but the names are redacted, replaced with number designations. Researcher 33, Researcher 42, Researcher 59, and 7 others, 10 in total, killed in whatever happened on that May Day 70 years ago. But Researcher 47 is not among the dead. Instead, there's a separate notation, more disturbing than a simple death record would have been. R47 cannot be located. Full facility sweep completed. No remains recovered. No trace evidence found. Security review conducted. Recommend immediate termination of Eclipse program and redistribution of remaining personnel to alternative research tracks. Oversight to be assumed by Continuity Division pending final disposition. He had vanished. A handful of people working on the fringes of conspiracy research, people who study these fragments in their spare time while working ordinary jobs, have tried to find out what happened to Researcher 47 after May 1953. They've searched death records, immigration records, military personnel files, hospital records. They've looked for anyone who might match the few details that can be inferred from the documents. They found nothing. No death record. No subsequent employment anywhere in the government or private sector. No medical records. No trace in any database, no matter how obscure. Either he died in that incident and for some reason his body was never recovered or couldn't be identified, or he disappeared in some other way that left no trace. Or, according to the darkest version of the theory, the one that even most conspiracy researchers hesitate to voice out loud, whatever happened in that test succeeded in ways that the memo doesn't acknowledge. Whatever research was being conducted into consciousness and perception, and the alteration of reality itself, achieved some kind of breakthrough, and Researcher 47 became something that couldn't be recorded in conventional files, something that existed outside normal categories of life and death and identity. This is where the conspiracy theory crosses into pure speculation, untethered from any evidence or rational analysis. It's the kind of thing that makes serious researchers uncomfortable, the point where investigation into hidden history becomes science fiction or paranoid fantasy. But the speculation is worth noting because it reveals something about what people fear when they think about classified research into human consciousness. They don't just fear unethical experiments or violations of rights, they fear something deeper. They fear that some of this research might have actually worked, that somewhere in the classified history of intelligence programs, someone figured out how to fundamentally alter human consciousness, human perception, perhaps even human existence itself. And they fear that if it worked, it might still be working, that the capabilities developed in those hidden laboratories might still be in use, deployed against targets who would never know they were being manipulated, controlled, fundamentally changed from what they had been. It's an existential fear. Not just the fear of what was done to subjects in the past, but the fear of what might be being done to all of us right now. The fear that our thoughts might not be entirely our own, that our perceptions might be shaped by forces we can't detect, that free will itself might be something that can be overridden by the right combination of electromagnetic fields, chemical compounds, and psychological conditioning. These fears probably say more about our anxieties in the modern world than about any real capabilities that emerged from Project Eclipse or its successors, but the fragmentary evidence, the unexplained documents, the gaps in the record where something should be but isn't, these things feed the fears and keep the questions alive. Who was Researcher 47? What happened to him in May of 1953? And why, 70 years later, are his records still sealed more tightly than almost any other aspect of Cold War history? Act 5. The truth they'll never admit the incident in May of 1953, whatever it was, whatever really happened in whatever facility was conducting Eclipse research, appears to have been a turning point, a moment when something that had been controlled went out of control, when research that had been contained broke containment. All references to Project Eclipse in the fragmentary documents that can be found stop after that month. No more budget allocations in subsequent years. No more personnel transfers to eclipse-designated facilities. No more progress reports using eclipse terminology. The program seems to have simply ceased to exist, wiped from the record as completely as if it had never been there in the first place. But other things were happening in 1953 that provide context and raise more questions. 7 months after the eclipse incident, in November of that year, a CIA scientist named Frank Olson died after falling from a hotel window in New York City. Olson was a bacteriologist who worked at Fort Detrick on classified projects. The official story at the time was suicide, a tragic case of mental breakdown. Olson's family accepted this explanation, grieved, and tried to move on. 22 years later, in 1975, the truth began to emerge. Documents declassified as part of the Church Committee investigations revealed that Olson had been dosed with LSD without his knowledge, part of an MKUltra experiment. The drug had been slipped into his drink at a CIA retreat. Olson had reacted badly, becoming paranoid and disoriented. The agency had tried to manage the situation, but Olson's mental state deteriorated rapidly. A week after being dosed, he went through the window of his 10th floor hotel room. Was it suicide? Was it murder? Was it an accident during a psychotic episode? The truth has never been definitively established, but it became one of the most infamous casualties of the CIA's mind control research, a symbol of the ethical violations and reckless experimentation that characterized the program. The timing is suggestive. Olson died 7 months after the eclipse incident. Was there a connection? Did the catastrophic failure of one program lead directly to changes in another? Did Eclipse personnel, fleeing from whatever disaster had occurred in May, bring their research into the MKUltra program that was just getting started? MKUltra was officially authorized in April of 1953, just weeks before the Eclipse incident. It's possible that the two programs had overlapped, that Eclipse was running parallel to the early stages of MKUltra, perhaps exploring more extreme or exotic possibilities while MKUltra focused on more conventional approaches. It's also possible they were connected more directly. Perhaps Eclipse was a test bed, a place where the most radical experiments could be conducted before techniques were refined and transferred to MKUltra. Perhaps the Eclipse failure provided crucial data or warnings that shaped how MKUltra operated, teaching the CIA what boundaries couldn't be crossed without catastrophic consequences. Or perhaps, as some researchers have suggested, MKUltra was created specifically to be the public-facing version of research that was actually centered in Eclipse. The program that could be acknowledged, even if its details remained classified. The story they could tell if anyone asked too many questions about what was happening in certain facilities, what certain scientists were working on, where certain budget allocations were really going. While the real research, the research that had produced results too sensitive to ever reveal, continued elsewhere under deeper cover. This is pure speculation, unsupported by any direct evidence. But it fits a pattern that conspiracy researchers have identified in other classified programs, the existence of what they call sacrificial layers. Programs that are classified but deliberately discoverable, designed to absorb scrutiny and satisfy curiosity while protecting something deeper. The Manhattan Project is a good example. It was enormously secret during World War II, hidden behind elaborate cover stories and security measures. But after Hiroshima, it was revealed and gradually declassified. Books were written, documentaries were made, the story became public history. But aspects of the Manhattan Project remain classified to this day. Certain techniques, certain relationships, certain capabilities that were developed in the rush to build the first atomic bomb. These details stay hidden while the main story is told openly. MKUltra followed a similar pattern. It was exposed in the 1970s. Congressional hearings revealed its abuses and excessive experimentation. The CIA director formally apologized. Thousands of documents were released to researchers and the public. The story became known history, a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked intelligence agencies. But significant portions of MKUltra's files were destroyed before they could be subpoenaed. In 1973, when it became clear that congressional investigators were closing in, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered the destruction of all MKUltra records. Most of the files were shredded or burned. What survived was damning enough. Proof of illegal experimentation, violations of human rights, reckless endangerment of innocent people. The documents that were released painted a picture of an agency that had lost its moral bearings in pursuit of mind control capabilities. But what was in the files that were destroyed? What was so sensitive that it couldn't be allowed to survive even congressional investigation? And through all the investigations and revelations and declassifications of the 70s, through all the testimony and leaked documents and journalistic exposés, Project Eclipse never came up. Not once. It was never mentioned in congressional hearings, never referenced in released CIA documents, never investigated by any official body, either because it never existed, because the handful of references that researchers have found in obscure corners of declassified documents are mistakes or misunderstandings or forgeries, or because it was protected by a level of security that MKUltra never had, because it represented research that went so far beyond MKUltra's experiments with LSD and hypnosis that it could never be revealed, not even in the wave of exposure that supposedly brought transparency to intelligence operations, because some secrets are kept secret forever. Epilogue. The signature that couldn't be 20 years after Evan Hartley saw that classified folder in the National Archives, after 2 men from the Office of Special Investigations had taken it away and warned him never to speak of it, he finally broke his silence. He was 68 years old by then, retired from government service for a decade, living quietly with his wife in a comfortable house in suburban Maryland. His children were grown and scattered across the country. He had grandchildren he doted on. He had a garden he tended and books he read, and a life that was, by any conventional measure, pleasant and peaceful. But he had never forgotten what he had seen that June afternoon in 1998. The photograph of Von Braun with unknown men, the list of Category 2 specialists with their strange specializations, the Eclipse memorandum signed by a man who wasn't supposed to be signing anything in 1947, the final page ordering termination of civilian access and continuation of research off-site. And he had never forgotten the 2 men who had taken it away, particularly the older one with eyes that saw everything and revealed nothing, who had warned Hartley that some things needed to stay buried. For 2 decades, he had kept his silence. He had followed the implicit command. He had told no one, not even his wife during their most intimate moments, not even his closest friends over drinks when conversation turned to mysteries and conspiracies and the hidden machinery of government. But in 2018, when Hartley was old enough to feel the weight of his years and brave enough not to care about consequences anymore, he decided to tell someone. Not a journalist who might sensationalize the story. Not an official investigator who would be bound by the same classification restrictions that had hidden Eclipse in the first place. But a researcher, a historian who had spent his career studying Operation Paperclip and who might understand the significance of what Hartley had seen. The researcher was a professor at Georgetown University named Thomas Kellerman. He had written 2 books about Paperclip, meticulously researched and carefully documented. He approached the subject with academic rigour but also with moral seriousness, neither excusing the ethical compromises nor reducing them to simple propaganda. Hartley had read both books and trusted Kellerman's judgment. They met in a coffee shop in Bethesda on a cold November morning. Hartley told his story slowly, carefully, trying to remember every detail. Kellerman listened without interruption, taking notes on a yellow legal pad, his face showing nothing except professional interest. When Hartley finished, Kellerman asked the obvious questions. Was he sure about what he had seen? Could he describe the documents in more detail? Did he remember the exact names on the list? What about the men who had taken the folder? Hartley answered as best he could. But his memory after 20 years was imperfect. He could recall the general content of the documents, but not their exact wording. He could describe the photograph but not identify the unknown men in it. He remembered the warning he'd received but not the precise language used. Kellerman thanked him for coming forward. He said he would look into it, file some freedom of information, act requests, see what he could find. He knew researchers who specialised in finding classified documents, people who understood how to work the system and extract information that was technically public but hidden behind bureaucratic obstacles. But Hartley could see in Kellerman's eyes that the professor didn't expect to find anything. The story was too strange, the documents too sensitive, the time too long past. They shook hands and parted. Hartley drove home feeling simultaneously relieved and disappointed. He had finally told someone. The secret no longer sat in his chest like a stone, but nothing would come of it. The truth would stay buried. Kellerman, for his part, did what he had promised. He filed Freedom of Information Act requests for any documents related to Project Eclipse. He searched for references to Category 2 paperclip specialists in every database he could access. He reached out to other researchers, to retired intelligence officers, to anyone who might have heard something about a shadow program running parallel to the main paperclip operation. He found nothing. Every FOA request was denied, either because no responsive records could be located, or because any such records that might exist remained classified for national security reasons. Every search came up empty. Every person he spoke with had never heard of Eclipse. It was as if none of it had ever existed. As if Hartley had imagined the whole thing, or had somehow misinterpreted what he had seen. But then Kellerman found something else. Not through official channels, not through any FOIA request or database search, but by accident while researching something entirely different. He was going through a collection of declassified OSS documents from the late 1940s, material that had been released years earlier and was available to researchers at the National Archives. He was looking for references to William Donovan's post-war activities, trying to establish what role, if any, the former spy master had played in early CIA operations, despite his official retirement. The documents were mostly routine, meeting minutes from various committees, budget proposals, administrative memos about personnel and facilities, the mundane paperwork that any organisation generates. But in a batch of files from 1948 concerning security procedures at Camp King in Germany, Kellerman found a memo that made his hands stop moving. The memo itself was unremarkable. It discussed updating background check procedures for staff assigned to secure facilities, establishing new protocols for compartmentalised access, routine bureaucratic process. The kind of document that survives classification review precisely because it contains nothing sensitive or interesting. But at the bottom of the final page was a signature, a handwritten name, slightly faded but still legible after 7 decades. William J. Donovan. The same signature, with the same distinctive angular style that Hartley had described on the Eclipse memorandum, the same signature that should have belonged to a man who had retired from government service in October 1945. Kellerman stared at it for a long time. Then he carefully photographed the page with his phone and sent a copy to Hartley with a simple question. "Is this the signature you remember?" Hartley called him 2 hours later. His voice was shaking. "That's it," he said. "That's exactly it. I remember the way the J crosses the W in the first name, the way the final N in Donovan extends below the line. That's the signature I saw." Kellerman felt something cold settle in his stomach. Because if the signature was authentic, and there was no reason to think it wasn't, since it was on a document that had been declassified through normal channels decades ago, then it proved something important. Donovan had been active in intelligence work in 1948 despite his supposed retirement. He had been signing documents related to Camp King, where according to later revelations some of the earliest CIA interrogation experiments were conducted. And if he was doing that, then it was entirely plausible that he might have been involved in other classified programs as well. Programs that went even deeper than what happened at Camp King. Programs like Eclipse. Kellerman wrote back to Hartley, asking if there was anything else he remembered, any detail he might have forgotten to mention in their original conversation. Hartley was silent for a long moment on the phone. Then he spoke quietly. "There is one thing," he said. "I didn't mention it before because it seemed too small, too unimportant. But when those men took the folder, when the older one put it in his briefcase, I saw a name tag. One of those leather luggage tags that people attach when they travel. It was just visible for a moment before he closed the case." "What did it say?" Kellerman asked. already knowing somehow that the answer would be important. Eclipse continuity division. The words hung in the air between them. Kellerman felt his skin prickle. Continuity, he asked. Not completion or closure. Continuity, Hartley confirmed. Like it was still ongoing. Like it was something that needed to be continued indefinitely. That conversation took place in January of 2019. 21 years after Hartley had found the folder. 66 years after the supposed incident that had ended Project Eclipse. 71 years after the program had allegedly begun. If the name tag was real, if Hartley's memory was accurate, then Eclipse wasn't just history. It wasn't just a program that had existed once and then ended. It was something that had continued, something that was still being protected, something that required its own division, its own organisational structure, just to maintain the cover-up and ensure that whatever had been discovered remained hidden. Kellerman filed one more, Freedom of Information Act request, this time specifically asking for any documents related to an Eclipse continuity division or any similar organisational entity within the Department of Defence or intelligence community. The response came 6 weeks later. The single-page letter on Department of Defence letterhead, signed by an official in the Office of Freedom of Information. The text was brief. A thorough search of relevant records repositories has been conducted. No records responsive to your request have been identified. The entity named in your request does not exist and has never existed in any Department of Defence organisational structure. Further inquiries on this topic will not produce different results. Standard language, the kind of boilerplate response that government officers send to researchers who are chasing ghosts. Nothing unusual about it, except for one detail. At the bottom of the letter, below the printed signature, handwritten in blue ink in the margin, almost too small to read, were 3 words: "Stop requesting this." Kellerman stared at those 3 words for a long time. Then he carefully compared the handwriting to the signature he had found on the 1948 memo. They matched. The same angular style, the same way certain letters were formed, the same pressure and flow. The handwriting that belonged to William J. Donovan, who had died in February of 1959, 60 years before this letter was written. Operation Paperclip brought 1,600 German scientists to America after World War II. They helped build rockets and satellites. They helped win the space race and establish American technological supremacy. They helped land men on the moon and expand the boundaries of human achievement. This is historical fact. This is confirmed by thousands of documents and hundreds of witnesses and decades of research. This is taught in schools and documented in archives and accepted by serious historians around the world. But what if those 1,600 were just the public story, the acceptable face of something larger and darker? What if there were others, scientists whose work could never be acknowledged, whose presence could never be recorded, whose research went into areas that touched on the fundamental nature of human consciousness and perception? What if the real breakthroughs weren't in rocket science at all, but in the science of controlling minds? The ability to manipulate thought, perception, behaviour, perhaps even the structure of reality itself as experienced by human beings. What if some of that research succeeded in ways we still don't understand and aren't meant to discover? And what if it never stopped? What if somewhere in the maze of classified programs and compartmentalized research and black budgets that disappear into bureaucratic labyrinths, the work that began with those Category 2 specialists in the late 1940s continues still, protected by layers of deniability and maintained by people whose full-time job is ensuring that no one ever asks the right questions? The official records say Project Eclipse never existed. There are no files, no budgets, no personnel rosters, just fragments and anomalies scattered across decades of declassified documents. Just stories from people like Evan Hartley, who saw something they shouldn't have seen and were warned never to speak of it. Maybe they're all mistaken. Maybe it's just conspiracy thinking, pattern making and random noise, the human tendency to see connections where none exist and create narratives from coincidence. Or maybe some secrets are kept so well that their very existence can be erased from history. Maybe there are programs so deeply classified that they leave almost no trace, maintained by people who understand that certain knowledge is too dangerous to ever be made public. Until someone finds a mislabeled box in an archive. Until someone asks a question that hits too close to something that should stay hidden. Until someone gets a response that they weren't supposed to get, written in handwriting that shouldn't exist. The truth about Operation Paperclip might not be about rockets at all. It might be about something far more disturbing and far more profound. Something that challenges our understanding of science, ethics, human consciousness, and the nature of reality itself. Something that was never declassified because it can never be declassified. Because it's still happening. Somewhere in the shadow of government secrecy, in facilities that don't appear on any map, under programs that have no names in any public record, the research that began with those Category 2 specialists might still continue. The work of understanding and manipulating human consciousness, perception, thought itself. And if it does, if even a fraction of this is true, then the question isn't just what they discovered in those hidden laboratories 70 years ago. It's what they've become capable of doing with that knowledge in all the years since. What techniques they've refined, what capabilities they've developed, what boundaries they've crossed in pursuit of control over the human mind. And whether we would even know if they were using those capabilities on us. Whether our thoughts are entirely our own. Whether our perceptions of reality are authentic or shaped by forces we can't detect and wouldn't recognise if we could. Whether free will itself, the fundamental assumption underlying all of human society and morality and law, is something that can be overridden by the right combination of technology and technique developed in programs that officially don't exist. These are the questions that the story of Project Eclipse raises. Questions that can't be answered because the evidence is sealed or destroyed. Questions that most people will dismiss as paranoid fantasy. But questions that won't go away as long as fragments remain, as long as witnesses break their silence, as long as researchers find documents that shouldn't exist and signatures that belong to dead men. What if the most dangerous secrets aren't hidden in classified files, but buried in plain sight, in the footnotes of forgotten academic papers? What if the government's most classified unit wasn't studying aliens at all, but something far more terrifying? Something that's been manipulating human belief since the dawn of civilization itself? Before we dive into tonight's story, I want to give a shout out to Jeffernon 1772 for suggesting this incredible topic. Your video ideas keep sleep theories going, so please, drop your suggestions in the comments below, and if you're enjoying these deep dives into the unknown, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Now let's talk about the Collins Elite, and why they might be the most important government program you've never heard of. I wasn't looking for UFOs, I was looking for a way to pay rent. The gig economy had chewed me up and spit me out more times than I cared to count. Web design, freelance writing, even a brief stint delivering food, nothing stuck. But when Dr. Martinelli at the university offered me work as a research assistant, scanning old theological dissertations for the digital archive, I jumped at it. $25 an hour to sit in a quiet library basement, copying dusty Latin passages and obscure biblical references that nobody had touched in decades. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. The work was mind-numbing mostly. Endless pages of theological debates from the 1950s and 60s, written by seminary students who were probably dead by now. The Augustinian interpretation of angelic hierarchies, post-war perspectives on demonic manifestation, scriptural analysis of divine intervention in modern context. Heavy stuff, but about as exciting as watching paint dry. I'd been at it for 3 months when I found the reference that changed everything. It was October, around 2 a.m. I was halfway through a 1963 thesis titled Angelic Manifestations in Modern Times, 324 pages of dense theological argumentation by a seminarian named Marcus Whitmore. The kind of paper that made me question every life choice that had led me to that basement. I was scanning page 187, a particularly dry section about contemporary witness testimony, when a footnote caught my eye. It wasn't the content that stopped me, it was the context. The main text was discussing reports of luminous beings witnessed by various clergy members throughout the 1950s. Standard religious stuff, the kind of mystical experiences that show up in seminary papers all the time. But the footnote read, "For governmental perspective on similar phenomena, see Collins Elite Memorandum 1957, classification status unknown." I stared at that line for a full minute. It was cited like a real source, with the matter-of-fact tone of academic reference. No explanation, no context, just there. The problem was, this wasn't a section about government or politics. It was about angels. And the thesis was written by a seminary student, not a political science major. So why was he referencing what sounded like a classified government document in the middle of a paper about divine manifestations? I made a note and kept scanning, but the reference nagged at me. Collins Elite. It sounded official, maybe military. But why would a religious scholar in 1963 have access to classified material? And why would he cite it so casually, as if his readers would know what he was talking about? The next day, I couldn't concentrate on my assigned documents. Instead, I found myself searching the university's digital catalogue for any mention of Collins Elite. Nothing came up in the main database, but I had access to some of the restricted theological archives through Dr. Martinelli's login credentials. That's where I found the second reference. It was in a 1959 lecture transcript from a Catholic seminary in Maryland. The speaker was Father Benedict Toretti, discussing unusual spiritual encounters in the post-war era. Most of the lecture was standard theological fare, but near the end, during what appeared to be an informal Q&A session, someone asked about government interest in religious phenomena. Father Toretti's response was brief but loaded. There are those in Washington who understand that not all mysteries can be solved with science. The Collins Elite represents a different approach to certain questions, but we must be careful not to mistake understanding for wisdom or documentation for truth. The transcript noted uncomfortable silence after this comment, and the lecture ended shortly thereafter. 2 references, 2 religious contexts, both suggesting that Collins Elite was some kind of government program dealing with spiritual or supernatural phenomena. But why were religious scholars the only ones talking about it? And why did they all seem nervous about it? I spent the rest of the week diving deeper into the theological archives. The pattern that emerged was both fascinating and disturbing. Collins Elite didn't show up in UFO journals or conspiracy magazines. It didn't appear in scientific papers or military histories. Instead, it haunted the footnotes of religious documents like a ghost that only clergy could see. A 1958 exorcism report from a priest in New Mexico mentioned consultation with Collins Elite regarding non-terrestrial influences. A 1962 seminary paper on demonic deception in the modern age included a cryptic reference to Collins Elite protocols for distinguishing spiritual from extraplanetary phenomena. A 1961 lecture on comparative religion contained a single chilling line. As the Collins Elite has documented, the same entities that once appeared as gods now masquerade as visitors from the stars. Each reference was brief, almost coded, like the authors were speaking to an audience that would understand the implications without needing explanation. And always, the references appeared in contexts dealing with the supernatural, the spiritual, the otherworldly, but never in the way you'd expect. These weren't discussions of government cover-ups or alien conspiracies. They were warnings, theological warnings about deception, about false prophets, about entities that wore whatever mask humanity was willing to believe. I was starting to get a picture of something much stranger than a typical black project. Collins' elite wasn't studying UFOs the way the Air Force was. They were studying them the way the Catholic Church studied demons. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a misfiled document. I was scanning a collection of 1964 seminary papers when I found something that didn't belong. Mixed in with discussions of Vatican II reforms and modern catechism was a single-page document that looked nothing like the others. It was typed on official letterhead, something called Interdenominational Council on Anomalous Phenomena, and dated March 15th, 1959. The document was brief. Memo. Regarding recent Collins Elite Briefing 2, member institutions from Council Secretary following last week's presentation by Dr. Edward Collins regarding non-corporeal intelligence manifestations. The Council recommends the following protocols for clergy encountering anomalous phenomena. Do not assume extraterrestrial origin 2. Apply traditional discernment practices 3. Document all encounters per Collins Elite Guidelines 4. Report suspected deception campaigns immediately. Remember, the same entities that demanded worship as Baal and Moloch now request our trust as benevolent space brothers. The mask changes, the deception remains constant. Father Michael Torino, Council Secretary. My hands were shaking as I read it. This wasn't just a reference to Collins Elite. This was evidence of direct collaboration between the program and religious institutions. They were briefing clergy on how to handle UFO encounters, but from a theological perspective. And that last paragraph, it was suggesting that UFO entities weren't aliens at all. They were something much older and more dangerous, masquerading as extraterrestrials just as they had once masqueraded as ancient gods. I photographed the document with my phone and started digging into this interdenominational council. What I found made my blood run cold. The Interdenominational Council on Anomalous Phenomena existed from 1957 to 1969, according to what little I could find. Its membership included representatives from major Christian denominations, Jewish religious authorities, and even some Islamic scholars. The council was supposedly formed to coordinate religious response to unusual phenomena in the post-war era. That was the official line anyway. The reality appeared to be much more specific. I found meeting minutes from 1958 that discussed the Collins Elite Presentation on Entity Communication Patterns. A 1960 report mentioned successful implementation of Collins Elite discernment protocols in 17 states. A 1962 memorandum warned of increased entity activity coinciding with popular UFO narratives. The council wasn't just studying religious phenomena in general. They were specifically focused on what they called entity encounters, and they were working directly with Collins Elite to develop responses. The most disturbing document I found was a 1961 report titled Spiritual Warfare in the Space Age. It outlined what the Council believed to be a deliberate deception campaign by non-human entities. Historical analysis suggests consistent behavioural patterns across millennia. Entities appearing as divine beings in ancient times demanded worship, sacrifice, and absolute obedience. Modern manifestations as space visitors request trust, cooperation, and technological exchange. The underlying objective, human subjugation, remains unchanged. The report went on to detail specific cases where UFO contactees had reported entities claiming to be from various star systems, but whose messages contained elements identical to ancient religious texts describing demonic deception. According to the Council's analysis, the entities were running the same con they'd always run. They just updated their costumes for each era. As I dug deeper into the Council's documents, I started to notice something unsettling. My research wasn't going unnoticed. It started small. Dr. Martinelli mentioned that someone had been asking about my work. Just routine monitoring, he said, but he looked uncomfortable about it. Then I noticed that some of the documents I'd photographed were being moved to different sections of the archive. Files that had been easily accessible suddenly required special permission to view. The final warning came on a Tuesday night in November. I was alone in the archive basement scanning a particularly interesting 1963 document about Collins Elite Field Operations when my computer screen flickered. The document disappeared, replaced by a simple text message. "Stop looking, they're not what you think." I stared at the screen, heart pounding. Someone was monitoring my research in real time. Someone with access to the university's network, and probably a lot more than that. I should have stopped then. Any reasonable person would have backed off, found a different job, maybe moved to a different city. But I wasn't reasonable anymore. I was obsessed. And besides, whoever was watching had just confirmed that I was onto something real. I replied by typing into the same text box that had appeared on my screen. "Then what are they?" The response came immediately. "They've worn every mask we've ever worshipped." The screen flickered again and the message disappeared. But the implication was crystal clear. Collins Elite wasn't just studying UFO entities. They'd concluded that these entities were the same beings that had manipulated human religious belief throughout history. Ancient gods, modern aliens, same entities, different costumes. After the warning, access to documents became nearly impossible. Files went missing. Archives were suddenly under renovation. Dr. Martinelli stopped returning my emails. It was clear that my research had triggered some kind of response from whoever wanted Collins Elite to remain buried. But I'd already seen enough to piece together the broad outline of their doctrine. Collins Elite appeared to be a small classified unit within the US government that approached the UFO phenomenon from a religious rather than scientific perspective. Based on the scattered evidence I'd found, their core beliefs seemed to be UFO entities were not extraterrestrial visitors. They were the same non-corporeal beings that had interacted with humans throughout history. These entities had consistently masqueraded as whatever humans were most likely to worship or trust. Their ultimate goal was the spiritual subjugation of humanity. The modern UFO phenomenon was simply their latest deception campaign. The unit apparently worked closely with religious leaders to develop protocols for identifying and resisting entity influence. They studied religious texts not for historical interest, but for tactical intelligence about entity behaviour patterns. They viewed exorcists and clergy as frontline personnel in a spiritual war that most people didn't even know was happening. Most disturbing of all, they seemed to believe they were losing. My research into Collins Elite had taken nearly 6 months, and by December I was running out of leads. The documents had dried up, my access was severely restricted, and I was starting to wonder if I'd ever find anything more concrete than footnotes and oblique references. That's when I decided to look at modern UFO phenomena through the Collins Elite lens. What I found was terrifying in its consistency. Contemporary UFO contactee reports, when examined from a religious perspective, showed the same patterns that Collins Elite had apparently identified in the 1950s. Entities claiming to be from Zeta Reticuli or the Pleiades, but whose messages contained elements identical to ancient Gnostic texts. Space brothers, preaching salvation through technological advancement, using language that echoed Mesopotamian religious propaganda. Abduction experiences that followed the same psychological patterns as historical demonic possession cases. The modern UFO disclosure movement, viewed through Collins Elite's framework, looked less like a quest for scientific truth and more like the latest phase of an ancient deception campaign. Entities that had once demanded worship as gods now requested trust as benevolent aliens. Same control mechanisms, updated for a scientific age. I started to understand why Collins Elite had worked so closely with religious authorities. If you believe that UFO entities were actually spiritual beings with thousands of years of experience in manipulating human belief systems, then scientists and military analysts were the wrong people to study them. You needed theologians. You needed people who understood the long history of spiritual deception and the psychological mechanisms of faith. You needed people who could recognize the same lie being told with new words. I thought I'd reached the end of my research when I received an unexpected email in January. The sender was listed as archive.recovery@gmail.com, obviously a throwaway account. The message was brief. You've been asking the right questions. Room 847 basement level manuscript collection. Look behind the Milton volumes. 1 hour only. I almost deleted it. Every instinct told me it was a trap, but the Collins Elite investigation had become an obsession, and I couldn't walk away from what might be my last chance at finding real answers. An hour later, I was in the basement of the manuscript collection, a building I'd never visited before. Room 847 was a cramped storage room filled with old books and filing cabinets. The Milton volumes were easy to find, a complete set of Paradise Lost editions dating back to the 1800s. Behind the books, taped to the back of the shelf, was a manila envelope. Inside was a single document that changed everything I thought I knew about Collins Elite. It was typed on official US government letterhead, dated August 12, 1969, and marked Eyes Only Collins Elite Termination Report. The document was brief but explosive. Memorandum for the record subject: termination of Collins Elite program. Effective immediately. All Collins Elite operations are suspended indefinitely. Program termination follows unanimous recommendation by Collins Elite senior staff. Reason for termination: successful entity infiltration of program hierarchy. Evidence suggests long-term entity influence over program direction since 1961. Collins Elite conclusions regarding entity nature remain valid. However, program itself has been compromised beyond recovery. All Collins Elite personnel are reassigned. All documents classified at highest levels. Religious community partnerships terminated. Interdenominational council dissolved. Public disclosure of Collins Elite findings is prohibited under national security provisions. Final assessment: the entities we sought to understand and counter have proven more sophisticated than anticipated. They have successfully used our own investigation against us, turning our knowledge into a tool for their agenda. The Collins Elite program has become part of the deception we were created to expose. Any future investigation of these phenomena must proceed under the assumption that traditional government and academic institutions are compromised. Minus Dr. Edward Collins, Program Director. I read the document 3 times before the implication sank in. Collins Elite hadn't just been terminated because of budget cuts or bureaucratic reshuffling. It had been terminated because the entities they were studying had infiltrated and co-opted the program itself. The Watchers had been turned into accomplices, and if that was true in 1969, what did it mean for every government UFO program since then? Sitting in that storage room, holding what might be the last authentic Collins Elite document ever created, I finally understood the true scope of what I'd uncovered. Collins Elite hadn't been a fringe program run by religious zealots. It had been a serious government investigation that reached a conclusion so disturbing that the entities being studied had been forced to destroy it. The program had gotten too close to the truth, so the truth had destroyed the program. But what was that truth? Based on everything I'd found, Collins Elite had concluded that the UFO phenomenon was not extraterrestrial contact, but rather the latest phase of an ancient psychological operation. Non-corporeal entities, call them demons, call them interdimensional beings, call them whatever you want, had been manipulating human belief systems for millennia. They had appeared as gods to ancient peoples, demanding worship and sacrifice. They had manifested as angels and devils to medieval societies, shaping religious doctrine. And now they were appearing as alien visitors to a technological civilization, promoting their agenda through the language of science and space exploration. The genius of it was that each generation thought they were encountering something new. Ancient peoples saw divine visitation. Medieval believers saw spiritual manifestation. Modern witnesses see extraterrestrial contact. But according to Collins Elite, it was always the same entities, always running the same basic deception, always working toward the same goal, the spiritual and psychological subjugation of humanity. The entities had realised that direct worship was no longer feasible in a scientific age, so they had adapted, presenting themselves as technologically advanced aliens who could offer humanity salvation through scientific advancement. Instead of demanding worship, they requested trust. Instead of requiring sacrifice, they asked for cooperation. But the underlying dynamic remained the same: humans giving up their autonomy to beings who claimed to have their best interests at heart. And if Collins' elite was right, the modern UFO disclosure movement was simply the latest phase of this deception campaign. The termination document explained why I'd never heard of Collins' elite in any mainstream UFO research. It wasn't being covered up by the government to hide alien contact. It was being covered up because the government itself had been compromised by the entities Collins' elite were studying. Think about it. Every major government UFO program since Collins' elite, Project Blue Book, AA-TIP, the UAP Task Force, had approached the phenomenon from a purely technological perspective. They studied craft capabilities, flight patterns, potential propulsion systems. They never asked the questions Collins' elite had been asking. What do these entities actually want? Why do their messages always promote dependence rather than independence? Why do their promises of enlightenment always require surrender of human agency? Those questions weren't being ignored by accident. According to the termination document, they were being actively suppressed by entities who had learned to work within government and academic institutions. The modern UFO research community, the disclosure advocates, the scientists studying anomalous aerial phenomena, they might all be sincere in their efforts, but they were asking the wrong questions. They were looking for extraterrestrial contact when they should have been looking for spiritual deception. And that meant that every major UFO revelation of the past 50 years might actually be part of the deception Collins' elite had tried to expose. I left that storage room with more questions than answers, but one thing was crystal clear. Collins' elite had tried to warn us, and we hadn't listened. Worse, we might not be capable of listening because the entities they warned us about had apparently learned to control the conversation. Over the following weeks, I tried to verify the termination document through official channels. I filed Freedom of Information Act requests. I contacted government historians. I reached out to former intelligence officials. The responses were universally the same. No record of any program called Collins' Elite existed in official government files. But that didn't mean the program had never existed. It just meant that someone had been very thorough in erasing it. The more I thought about it, the more the Collins' Elite scenario made sense of things that had always bothered me about the UFO phenomenon. Why did entity messages always promote technological dependence rather than spiritual development? Why did alien contact always require humans to abandon their traditional belief systems? Why did every promised revelation turn out to be just another layer of mystery? According to Collins' Elite, it was because the entities weren't trying to enlighten us. They were trying to control us. And the best way to control a technologically advanced species was to convince them that salvation could only come through higher technology, provided by beings who claimed to have humanity's best interests at heart. The ancient formula updated for a scientific age. After finding the termination document, I thought my Collins' Elite investigation was over, but 2 weeks later, I received another cryptic email from the same archive. Recovery account. You found the termination report. Good. Now find the real archive. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, Georgetown University Theology Department. Tell him Marcus sent you. I almost ignored it. The rational part of my brain was screaming that I was already in too deep, that whoever was feeding me information might be leading me into something dangerous. But the name Marcus rang a bell. Marcus Whitmore, the author of that first 1963 thesis, where I'd found the Collins' Elite reference. Could he still be alive? Dr. Rodriguez's office was in a converted Victorian house on the Georgetown campus, tucked between the main theology building and an old chapel. When I mentioned that Marcus had sent me, her reaction was immediate and alarming. She locked her office door, closed the blinds, and pulled out a device I later learned was a radio frequency detector. 62 years, she said quietly, sweeping the device around the room. 62 years Marcus has been waiting for someone to follow the trail far enough to find him. He's 91 years old and still afraid they're listening. Dr. Rodriguez led me through a maze of basement corridors beneath the theology building to a climate-controlled storage room I never could have found on my own. Inside, Marcus Whitmore sat surrounded by filing cabinets that looked like they'd been moved there decades ago. He was ancient, but his eyes were sharp and alert. "You're the one asking about Collins Elite," he said. It wasn't a question. "Eleanor tells me you found the termination report. That means they decided you were ready." "They?" "The survivors. The ones who got out before the infiltration was complete." He gestured to the filing cabinets around us. "We've been maintaining our own archive for over 50 years. Everything the government tried to bury, we preserved." What Marcus showed me over the next 6 hours changed everything I thought I knew about Collins Elite and about the scope of the deception they had uncovered. Collins Elite hadn't begun as a government program at all. It had started in 1947 as an informal network of military officers, intelligence analysts and religious scholars who were disturbed by early UFO reports. What bothered them wasn't the craft themselves, but the messages being delivered by the entities inside them. The contactee movement was just getting started, Marcus explained, pulling out files from the late 1940s. George Adamski, Daniel Fry, Truman Bethurum, all these people claiming contact with benevolent space brothers. But when you analysed their messages from a theological perspective, they weren't promoting human spiritual development. They were promoting dependence. The early Collins Elite had conducted detailed analyses of contactee messages and found disturbing patterns. The entities consistently promoted several key themes: the inadequacy of human religion, the necessity of technological advancement, the benefits of surrendering human decision-making to superior beings, and the dangers of independent spiritual development. It was the same psychological framework used by every cult in history, Dr. Rodriguez added. Isolate the subject from their support systems, convince them that traditional sources of guidance are inadequate, then position yourself as the only reliable source of truth. But Collins Elite's analysis went deeper than simple cult mechanics. They had identified specific linguistic and conceptual patterns that appeared across different contactee cases, patterns that matched historical accounts of demonic deception dating back thousands of years. Marcus showed me a 1952 analysis comparing Adamski's alleged conversations with Venusian beings to transcripts from 16th century witch trials. The parallels were undeniable. The same promises of secret knowledge, the same dismissal of conventional morality, the same emphasis on the chosen status of the contactee. That's when we knew we were dealing with something ancient, Marcus said. These weren't aliens from space. They were the same entities that had been manipulating human belief systems since the beginning of recorded history. By 1957, Collins Elite had attracted official government attention. The CIA and military intelligence were struggling to understand the UFO phenomenon from a technological perspective, but Collins Elite was approaching it from an entirely different angle and getting results. We could predict contactee behaviour patterns, Dr. Rodriguez explained. We could identify which cases were likely to be genuine entity contact versus hoaxes or psychological episodes. We could even predict what messages the entities would deliver in future contacts. This predictive ability had made Collins Elite invaluable to government agencies dealing with UFO incidents. But it had also made them a target. Marcus pulled out a thick file labelled Entity Response Patterns, 1958 to 1961. Inside were dozens of reports documenting how UFO activity and contactee experiences changed in response to Collins Elite investigations. Whenever we got too close to exposing their methods, they would shift tactics, Marcus said. Study their linguistic patterns too closely, and suddenly contactees would start receiving messages in completely different styles. Document their technological claims, and they would start demonstrating entirely different capabilities. The entities weren't just running a deception campaign. They were actively monitoring the investigators and adapting their approach in real time. But the most disturbing pattern was personal targeting. Collins Elite members began experiencing their own anomalous encounters, but these experiences were clearly designed to discredit or manipulate the investigators, rather than provide genuine contact. Dr. Edward Collins himself was contacted in 1960, Marcus revealed. The entity claimed to be from Rigel and offered to provide him with advanced technology in exchange for shutting down the Collins Elite program. When he refused, the encounters became increasingly threatening. Other Collins Elite members reported similar experiences, contact attempts that seemed designed to either co-opt them or drive them out of the program entirely. The entities were fighting back. The termination document I'd found told only part of the story. The real disaster began in 1961 when Collins Elite was formally incorporated into the government's UFO investigation apparatus. "That was our mistake," Marcus said bitterly. "We thought official recognition would give us more resources, better access to witness testimony, protection from entity retaliation. Instead, it gave them access to us." With official status came new personnel assignments, government oversight, and integration with other classified programs. Collins Elite's small, tight-knit network of trusted researchers was suddenly flooded with new members whose backgrounds couldn't be thoroughly vetted. The infiltration was subtle at first, Dr. Rodriguez explained. New analysts who would subtly shift the focus of investigations, administrative personnel who would lose crucial documents, supervisors who would redirect resources toward more promising lines of inquiry. By 1965, original Collins Elite members were reporting that their research conclusions were being systematically altered before reaching higher-level officials. Analyses emphasizing the deceptive nature of entity contact were being rewritten to focus on potential technological benefits. Warnings about spiritual manipulation were being deleted entirely. Marcus showed me internal memos from 1966 to 1968, documenting the growing suspicion among original Collins Elite members that their program had been compromised. They began conducting parallel investigations using secure channels, trying to determine whether the infiltration was the result of foreign intelligence operations, bureaucratic incompetence, or something more sinister. By 1968, we had our answer, Marcus said grimly. It was the entities themselves. They had learned to work through human intermediaries, people who might not even be consciously aware that they were being influenced. The evidence was subtle but damning. New Collins Elite personnel consistently made decisions that served entity interests, redirecting investigations away from deception analysis, promoting contactees who delivered pro-entity messages, suppressing research that exposed manipulation tactics. The final proof came when Dr. Collins tried to present his findings to the Defense Intelligence Agency in 1969, Dr. Rodriguez said. His presentation was completely rewritten between the time he submitted it and the time it was delivered. Instead of warning about entity deception, it recommended increased cooperation with UFO intelligences. That was when the original Collins Elite members realized their program had been completely subverted. The Watchers had become the watched, and the watched had become the watchers. Rather than fight a battle they couldn't win within government channels, the original Collins Elite members made a radical decision. They would fake the program's termination while secretly continuing their research through private channels. The termination report you found was genuine, Marcus explained, but it wasn't the end of Collins Elite. It was the beginning of the real investigation. Using their existing contacts within religious institutions, academia and government, the Collins Elite survivors established a covert network for continuing their research. They couldn't publish their findings or seek official recognition, but they could continue gathering evidence and developing their understanding of the entity deception campaign. "We've been operating continuously for over 50 years, Dr. Rodriguez said, documenting entity activity, analysing their evolving strategies, tracking their infiltration of various institutions. The underground Collins Elite had identified several key developments since 1969. The entities had largely abandoned individual contactee operations in favour of influencing institutions directly. Rather than delivering messages through isolated individuals who could be easily dismissed, they were now working through respected scientists, government officials and religious leaders. They had also shifted their primary narrative from spiritual enlightenment to technological salvation. Instead of promising cosmic consciousness or spiritual advancement, they were now focusing on environmental solutions, clean energy, and space exploration. Most significantly, they had begun preparing for mass disclosure rather than gradual revelation. The underground Collins elite believed this represented the final phase of a deception campaign that had been in development for decades. Marcus and Dr. Rodriguez walked me through 50 years of documented entity influence on human institutions. The pattern was consistent but sophisticated. Entities never directly controlled human behaviour, but they influenced it through carefully orchestrated synchronicities, technological inspirations, and strategic information releases. "Look at the development of computer technology," Dr. Rodriguez said, showing me files documenting unusual technological leaps in electronics and computing since the 1960s. Every major breakthrough happened shortly after UFO encounters involving personnel who were in positions to influence research directions. The entities weren't providing blueprints or direct technological assistance. Instead, they were inspiring specific lines of research, guiding human scientists toward discoveries that served long-term entity interests. The internet, social media, artificial intelligence, all of these technologies have made humanity more connected but also more controllable, Marcus observed. They've created systems that can monitor and influence human behaviour on a global scale. According to underground Collins elite analysis, the entities had been systematically encouraging the development of technologies that would make mass psychological manipulation easier, while simultaneously making individual privacy and independence more difficult. But the most disturbing revelation was their analysis of the modern UFO disclosure movement itself. Every major disclosure advocate, every government whistleblower, every scientist calling for serious UFO research, we've documented anomalous encounters in their backgrounds, Dr. Rodriguez said. They're not consciously working for the entities, but they're all promoting the same basic narrative, that UFO contact is inevitable, beneficial, and should be embraced rather than resisted. The underground Collins elite had identified specific psychological themes being promoted through disclosure advocates: the inadequacy of human civilization, the necessity of outside intervention, the benefits of technological advancement over spiritual development, and the dangers of resistance to contact. It's the same message the contactees were delivering in the 1950s, Marcus said, just delivered through more credible sources and backed by more sophisticated evidence. According to the underground Collins elite's analysis, the current disclosure campaign was preparation for something unprecedented: open entity contact with humanity as a whole, rather than selected individuals. They've spent 70 years testing human responses, refining their approach, identifying the most effective manipulation strategies, Dr. Rodriguez explained. Now they're ready to scale up. The evidence they showed me was circumstantial but compelling. Government UFO programs consistently focused on technological aspects while ignoring behavioral and psychological elements. Scientific studies of anomalous phenomena emphasized physical measurements, while dismissing witness testimony about entity motivations. Media coverage promoted wonder and excitement about potential contact, while discouraging analysis of entity intentions. They're engineering consent, Marcus said, creating a cultural context where open contact will be seen as humanity's graduation to a higher level of existence rather than submission to a superior intelligence. The underground Collins elite believed that formal contact would be presented as humanity's invitation to join a galactic community, with entities offering technological solutions to environmental problems, social conflicts, and resource limitations. The offer would seem generous, beneficial, and desperately needed. But according to their analysis, acceptance would come with costs that wouldn't become apparent until it was too late. The gradual replacement of human decision-making systems with entity-guided alternatives, the erosion of individual agency in favour of collective efficiency, and the redefinition of human spiritual development to align with entity objectives. It won't feel like conquest, Dr. Rodriguez said. It will feel like salvation, right up until the moment humans realise they've traded their freedom for security, and they're no longer capable of making that trade in reverse. After hours of reviewing evidence and analysis, I asked the obvious question: if the underground Collins elite was right about entity intentions, what could be done to counter them? Marcus and Dr. Rodriguez exchanged glances before Marcus answered carefully. Individual resistance is possible but difficult, he said. The entities rely on collective consent and institutional cooperation. They can't force contact on humans who genuinely reject it, but they can make such rejection seem irrational, antisocial or harmful. The underground Collins elite had developed what they called spiritual inoculation, techniques for recognizing and resisting entity influence. These included traditional religious practices like prayer and meditation, but also more analytical approaches, questioning the source and motivation behind any message promoting dependence, examining whether proposed solutions increased or decreased human agency, and maintaining strong connections to human community and traditional wisdom. The entities are masters of isolation and dependency, Dr. Rodriguez explained. Their influence is weakest when humans are connected to each other and to their own spiritual traditions, and strongest when individuals feel cut off from community and traditional sources of guidance. But individual resistance wouldn't be enough if the entities succeeded in achieving mass consent for contact. The underground Collins elite believed that their most important function was preserving and disseminating knowledge about entity deception methods, so that future generations would have the tools needed to recognize and resist manipulation. That's why we've maintained this archive, Marcus said, and why we're sharing it with you now. The disclosure campaign is accelerating, and we may not have much time left to prepare people for what's coming. As I write this, the UFO disclosure movement is reaching a crescendo. Government officials are admitting that anomalous aerial phenomena are real. Military personnel are testifying about encounters with craft displaying impossible capabilities. Scientists are calling for serious study of the phenomenon. The public is being prepared for some kind of revelation. But if Collins' elite was right, that revelation might be the culmination of a deception campaign that began thousands of years ago. Think about how perfectly the current disclosure narrative fits the Collins elite framework. We're being told that non-human intelligence has been monitoring humanity, that these beings possess technology that could solve our energy and environmental problems, that contact is inevitable and potentially beneficial. We're being encouraged to view disclosure as a positive development, a step forward in human evolution. But what if it's actually the final step in a plan that began when the first human looked at the sky and wondered if the gods were watching? The entities Collins' elite studied had thousands of years to perfect their understanding of human psychology. They knew that direct domination would eventually fail, that humans would rebel against obvious tyranny, but they also knew that humans could be convinced to surrender their autonomy willingly, if the surrender was framed as enlightenment or advancement. The promise of godhood had worked for ancient peoples. The promise of salvation had worked for medieval societies. And the promise of technological transcendence might be working on us right now. Marcus and Dr. Rodriguez had given me a framework for understanding the entity deception campaign, but they also gave me something more practical. A list of specific indicators that the final phase was beginning. We've been tracking these markers for decades, Dr. Rodriguez explained, showing me a comprehensive timeline of predicted developments. When all of them align, it means the entities believe humanity is ready for open contact. The first indicator was mainstream media normalization of UFO phenomena, not just reporting on UFO incidents, but actively promoting the idea that contact would be beneficial. According to their analysis, this phase had begun in earnest around 2017 and was accelerating rapidly. The second indicator was government disclosure of UAP reality without disclosure of government conclusions about entity intentions. They're admitting the phenomena are real, while carefully avoiding any discussion of what the entities actually want, Marcus noted. This creates public curiosity without public wariness. The third indicator was increased entity activity designed to demonstrate technological superiority while maintaining plausible deniability. The recent UAP videos released by the Pentagon fit this pattern perfectly. Clear evidence of advanced technology, but no direct communication or obvious threat. The fourth indicator was the emergence of credible advocates for contact within scientific, military, and government institutions. People with impressive credentials and no obvious ulterior motives, all promoting the same basic message: that humanity should welcome contact rather than fear it. Look at the current disclosure advocates, Dr. Rodriguez said. showing me biographical information on various scientists and former government officials. Impressive backgrounds, sincere motivations, reasonable arguments, but they're all promoting the same narrative the entities have been pushing for 70 years. The fifth and most disturbing indicator was the systematic suppression of research into entity psychology and motivations. While technological aspects of UAP were receiving increased attention and funding, questions about entity intentions were being dismissed as unscientific or irrelevant. That's how you know the entities are controlling the conversation, Marcus said. Any investigation that might reveal their true agenda gets discredited or defunded, while investigations that support their preferred narrative receive institutional support. According to their tracking system, all 5 indicators were currently active and accelerating. The underground Collins elite believed this meant humanity was within years, possibly months, of formal entity contact. Before I left Georgetown that day, Marcus pulled me aside for a private conversation. "You need to understand what you're walking into," he said quietly. "Everyone who's gotten this deep into Collins elite research has faced the same choice. Drop the investigation or accept that your life is going to change in ways you can't predict or control." He told me about colleagues who had been discredited through carefully orchestrated academic scandals, researchers who had lost funding after questioning entity motivations, investigators who had experienced personal crises that conveniently redirected their attention away from UFO phenomena. The entities don't usually resort to direct intimidation, Marcus explained. It's much more effective to make resistance seem personally costly. Failed relationships, career setbacks, health problems, family conflicts, all timed to coincide with getting too close to the truth. He showed me files documenting the life trajectories of dozens of Collins elite researchers over the past 50 years. The pattern was consistent. People who backed away from the investigation generally experienced improved circumstances, while those who continued faced escalating personal difficulties. "I'm not trying to scare you off," Marcus said, "but you need to know that this isn't just an intellectual exercise. The entities have a vested interest in controlling what humans believe about them, and they've had centuries to develop sophisticated methods for managing troublesome individuals." Dr. Rodriguez had faced similar pressures. Her tenure at Georgetown had been threatened twice due to budget constraints that mysteriously resolved themselves when she temporarily reduced her Collins elite research. Her marriage had ended during a period of intensive investigation into entity influence on religious institutions. Her health had suffered during the years she was most actively documenting entity deception patterns. "But here's the thing," she said. "The difficulties are real, but they're not insurmountable. The entities can make resistance costly, but they can't make it impossible. If they could simply eliminate troublesome humans, Collins elite would never have existed in the first place." She believed that entity limitations were precisely why the deception campaign was necessary. If entities could control human behavior directly, they wouldn't need to spend decades engineering consent for contact. The fact that they relied on manipulation suggested that human free will, while vulnerable to influence, remained fundamentally intact. Over the following months, Marcus and Dr. Rodriguez introduced me to other members of the underground Collins elite network. I was amazed by both the size and diversity of the group. Theologians and physicists, former intelligence analysts and current religious leaders, retired military officers and active researchers. What united them wasn't a shared background or ideology, but a shared conclusion that the UFO phenomenon represented a spiritual threat masquerading as a technological opportunity. Father Michael Torres, a Catholic exorcist based in New Mexico, had been documenting parallels between UFO encounters and demonic possession for 30 years. Dr. Rebecca Walsh, a psychiatrist specializing in religious experiences, had identified specific psychological patterns linking modern abduction accounts to historical accounts of spiritual deception. Colonel James Patterson, retired, former Air Force intelligence, had spent decades analyzing UFO incident reports and concluded that entity behavior was consistent with psychological warfare rather than scientific exploration. Each member of the network brought specialized knowledge and perspective, but all had reached similar conclusions about entity motivations and methods. More importantly, All had experienced some form of pressure or retaliation for their research, confirming the underground Collins elite's assessment that entity influence extended far beyond individual contactee cases. "We're not conspiracy theorists," Dr. Walsh explained during one of our meetings. "We're researchers who followed the evidence to an uncomfortable conclusion. The UFO phenomenon is real, the entities are real, but their intentions aren't what they claim to be." The network had developed sophisticated methods for secure communication and information sharing, operating on the assumption that their activities were being monitored by both government agencies and entity-influenced individuals within those agencies. "We have to assume that any information we share through normal channels will be compromised," Colonel Patterson explained. "But we also can't become so paranoid that we stop sharing information entirely. The entities benefit from our isolation more than our communication." As my involvement with the underground Collins elite deepened, I learned that the network extended far beyond the United States. Religious leaders in Europe, researchers in Asia, indigenous spiritual authorities in South America, all were reporting similar observations about entity activity and deception patterns. Dr. Rodriguez arranged for me to speak with several international contacts via encrypted communication channels. Their perspectives added crucial context to the Collins elite analysis. Brother Antonio Mendez, a Spanish monk who specialized in mystical theology, had been tracking entity influences on contemporary religious movements. His research suggested that entities were actively promoting syncretistic spiritual practices that emphasized cosmic consciousness over traditional religious authority. "They're not attacking religion directly," he explained through a translator. "They're subtly altering it, encouraging beliefs and practices that make humans more receptive to entity guidance and less connected to traditional sources of spiritual wisdom." Dr. Yuki Tanaka, a Japanese researcher studying anomalous phenomena in Buddhist contexts, had identified similar patterns in Asian spiritual communities. Entity influences seem designed to promote meditation practices that open practitioners to external guidance, while discouraging those that strengthened individual discernment and spiritual independence. Maria Santos, a shaman from Peru, described entity encounters that closely paralleled North American UFO contact reports, but framed in terms of traditional indigenous spirituality. The entities consistently promoted abandonment of ancestral traditions in favour of updated spiritual practices more suitable for the modern world. "Same spirits, different masks," she said simply. "They tell each culture what that culture wants to hear, but always with the same goal: make humans depend on them instead of their own traditions and wisdom." The global perspective confirmed the underground Collins elite's assessment that entity activity was coordinated across cultures and belief systems, but adapted to local contexts and expectations. The deception campaign wasn't centered in any particular country or religion. It was targeting human spiritual independence as a universal phenomenon. Based on decades of analysis and current trends, the underground Collins elite had developed a timeline for what they believed would be the final phase of the entity deception campaign. Phase 1, 2020 to 2025, mainstream normalization of UFO phenomena through government disclosure and media coverage. Emphasis on technological aspects while avoiding discussion of entity psychology or motivations. Gradual preparation of public consciousness for the possibility of contact. Phase 2, 2025 to 2030. Increased entity demonstrations designed to showcase technological capabilities and benevolent intentions, possibly including solutions to environmental or energy crises that humanity appears unable to solve independently. Growing public pressure for government contact initiatives. Phase 3, 2030 to 2035, formal contact between entity representatives and human governments. Presentation of comprehensive assistance packages addressing climate change, resource depletion, social conflicts and technological limitations. Initial agreements for limited cooperation and information exchange. Phase 4, 2035 to 2040. Gradual integration of entity guidance into human decision-making systems. Replacement of traditional political, economic and social structures with entity-recommended alternatives. Growing human dependence on entity technology and advice. Phase 5, 2040 plus. complete transformation of human civilization according to entity specifications, elimination of independent human spiritual development in favour of entity-directed consciousness evolution, humanity's transition from independent species to managed resource. The genius of the timeline is that each phase will seem like humanity's choice, Dr. Rodriguez explained. People will vote for leaders who support contact. They'll demand access to entity technology. They'll embrace changes that make their lives easier and more comfortable. Marcus nodded grimly. By the time humans realize they've traded their freedom for security, the infrastructure for independence will have been dismantled. They'll be completely dependent on systems they don't understand, controlled by entities they trusted. The timeline wasn't inevitable, according to Underground Collins' elite analysis, but it was highly probable unless humanity developed widespread awareness of entity deception methods and conscious resistance to manipulation. That's why we're talking to you, Marcus said, and why we've been talking to researchers like you for 50 years. Information is the only weapon we have against this kind of psychological operation. After months of research and analysis, I found myself facing the same choice that every Collins elite researcher had faced since 1947. Accept the implications of what I'd learned, or find a way to dismiss it as paranoid speculation. The evidence was circumstantial but extensive. The pattern was consistent but complex. The implications were staggering but difficult to prove conclusively, and the personal costs of continued investigation were becoming increasingly apparent. My freelance work had dried up mysteriously. Dr. Martinelli had stopped returning my calls after someone complained about my misuse of university resources. My relationship was suffering under the strain of the long hours spent on research I couldn't fully explain. My sleep was disrupted by dreams that felt more like memories of conversations I'd never had. But I also couldn't ignore what I'd learned. If Collins' elite was even partially correct, then humanity was walking into the most sophisticated trap in recorded history. And if that trap succeeded, future generations would live in a world where human independence was not just restricted, but literally unthinkable. The choice, ultimately, was between personal comfort and collective responsibility, between individual security and species survival, between the easy path of accepting official narratives and the difficult path of questioning everything I thought I knew about humanity's place in the universe. I chose to continue the investigation. It's been 6 months since my first meeting with Marcus and Dr. Rodriguez, and I'm no longer the same person who stumbled across that footnote in a theological dissertation. The evidence I've gathered has convinced me that Collins' elite was not only real, but correct in their fundamental assessment of the UFO phenomenon. We are not being visited by benevolent space brothers seeking to help humanity evolve to a higher level of consciousness. We are being manipulated by entities that have been perfecting deception techniques for millennia, entities that view humanity as a resource to be managed rather than a species to be assisted. The current UFO disclosure movement, whatever the sincere intentions of its individual advocates, is serving entity interests by preparing humanity to welcome contact rather than question it. The technological solutions being offered through various contact scenarios are not gifts, but baits in an elaborate trap that will close once humanity becomes dependent on entity guidance. And the most terrifying aspect is that it's working exactly as planned. Public opinion is shifting in favour of contact. Government agencies are admitting UFO reality while avoiding UFO psychology. Scientific institutions are studying technological aspects while ignoring behavioural patterns. Religious leaders are embracing cosmic spirituality while abandoning traditional discernment practices. We are being prepared for our own subjugation, and we're enthusiastically participating in the preparation process. But knowledge of a deception campaign, even a sophisticated one, provides power to resist it. The entities Collins' elite studied were powerful and cunning, but they were not omnipotent. Their influence depended on human ignorance, isolation, and consent. When humans understood their methods and refused to cooperate, entity influence diminished significantly. The underground Collins elite has spent 50 years documenting entity weaknesses as well as their strengths. They've developed techniques for recognizing and resisting manipulation. They've maintained networks of communication and support that entity influence cannot completely penetrate, and most importantly, they've preserved knowledge that would otherwise have been lost or corrupted. That knowledge is now available to anyone willing to look for it, question official narratives, and think independently about humanity's future. The choice between freedom and security, between independence and dependence, between human agency and entity guidance remains open. But that choice won't remain open forever. According to every timeline the underground Collins elite has developed, we are rapidly approaching the point where collective consent for entity contact will make individual resistance increasingly difficult and ultimately ineffective. The time for choosing is now. The information needed to choose wisely exists, but it requires effort to find and courage to accept. The consequences of choosing poorly may be irreversible. 60 years ago, Collins' elite tried to warn us. Today, their successors are still trying. Whether humanity listens and whether we choose wisely remains to be seen. But the warning has been delivered. The evidence has been presented, the choice is ours. Maybe that's why you never hear their name in congressional hearings or disclosure reports, because Collins' elite wasn't warning us about aliens. They were warning us about faith in the wrong thing, and how easily it can damn us. The question isn't whether Collins' elite really existed. The question is whether they were right. And if they were right, then everything we think we know about the UFO phenomenon might be part of the very deception they tried to expose. The entities they described have had 60 years to perfect their strategy since Collins' elite was terminated. 60 years to learn how to work within our institutions, shape our research, and guide our conclusions. 60 years to make sure that when disclosure finally comes, we'll welcome it with open arms. Because that's what good servants do, they welcome their masters home. But servants can choose to be free. The question is whether they will make that choice while they still can. That's tonight's deep dive into the Collins elite, a story that challenges everything we think we know about the UFO phenomenon and asks uncomfortable questions about the nature of contact itself. What do you think? Was Collins elite a real government program, or just an elaborate piece of disinformation? And either way, are the questions they were asking the ones we should be asking now? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to suggest topics for future episodes. Your ideas keep sleep theories going, and trust me, we've only scratched the surface of what's hidden in the footnotes of history. Until next time, sleep well and question everything. The glow of 17 monitors bathed Elias Corrin's face in an ethereal blue light as his fingers danced across 3 keyboards simultaneously. In the depths of his converted basement apartment, time moved differently. Days blurred into nights, and nights stretched endlessly as he navigated the labyrinthine pathways of the dark web like a digital archaeologist, uncovering humanity's buried secrets. At 32, Elias had already earned and lost 2 fortunes through his hacking prowess. First fortune came easily, a teenage prodigy exploiting security vulnerabilities for corporate clients who paid millions to keep their weaknesses secret. He'd lived like a digital king, penthouses overlooking Silicon Valley, exotic cars that remained untouched in climate-controlled garages, while he preferred the glow of his monitors to sunlight. That first fortune vanished when he exposed Meridian Pharmaceuticals' cover-up of deadly side effects in their breakthrough arthritis medication. The leaked documents showed they'd known their drug caused cardiac episodes in 12% of patients over 60, but had buried the studies to protect their $10 billion investment. Elias had expected whistleblower protection. Instead, he found himself blacklisted from every major tech company, his reputation destroyed by a coordinated character assassination campaign that painted him as an unstable idealist who couldn't be trusted with sensitive information. The second fortune came from smaller clients, criminal organisations, corporate espionage rings, government contractors who needed deniability. The work paid well but corroded his soul, each job pulling him deeper into the shadows of the digital underworld. That money disappeared into legal fees after a wrongful arrest for hacking the Federal Reserve, a crime he hadn't committed but couldn't prove he hadn't, given his reputation and the circumstantial evidence that seemed perfectly crafted to implicate him. 2 years in minimum security prison had shown him the true cost of challenging powerful systems. The other inmates respected his technical skills, but the guards treated him like a dangerous terrorist. Solitary confinement stretched for months whenever he complained about conditions or tried to organise better treatment for his fellow prisoners. By the time he was released on a technicality, evidence had mysteriously gone missing. He'd learned that the system didn't just punish dissent, it transformed dissidents into cautionary tales. Now, money meant nothing to him, only truth mattered. His obsession with secret societies began innocently enough, a childhood fascination sparked by his grandfather's stories about World War II intelligence operations. The old man had worked as a codebreaker for the OSS, predecessor to the CIA, and had filled young Elias's imagination with tales of hidden messages and shadow wars. After his grandfather's death when Elias was 12, he'd found boxes of declassified documents in the attic, revealing just how much of recent history had been shaped by invisible hands. That childhood fascination evolved into a methodical hunt for evidence as he grew older and acquired the technical skills to dig deeper than amateur conspiracy theorists ever could. While other hackers chased Bitcoin fortunes and corporate espionage contracts, Elias pursued shadows and whispers, digital phantoms that most people dismissed as paranoid delusions. He'd spent years infiltrating closed forums where former intelligence operatives shared war stories, decrypting abandoned hard drives from defunct government contractors, and following digital breadcrumbs through the dark web's most obscure corners. His apartment had become a digital monastery dedicated to the pursuit of hidden truth, every surface covered with the tools and detritus of obsessive investigation. The apartment reflected his singular focus. Pizza boxes stacked like ancient monuments between towers of computer equipment, energy drink cans forming metallic armies across every surface, and cables snaking through the darkness like digital veins feeding his electronic ecosystem. His only companions were the hum of cooling fans working overtime to prevent his overclocked processors from melting down, and the occasional satisfied grunt when another firewall fell to his expertise. The basement location was perfect for his needs, thick concrete walls that muffled sound and blocked electromagnetic interference, a dedicated power line that could handle his massive electrical requirements, and most importantly, no windows for curious neighbours to peer through. He'd been living there for 18 months, ever since his release from prison, paying cash to a landlord who asked no questions as long as the rent arrived on time. His setup was a temple to digital paranoia, 17 monitors arranged in a semicircle around his custom-built chair, each screen dedicated to different aspects of his ongoing investigations. 3 keyboards allowed him to manage multiple intrusion attempts simultaneously, while a collection of smartphones, each running different operating systems and connected to various networks through proxy chains, kept him connected to his sources around the globe. The walls were lined with hard drives, each containing terabytes of encrypted data collected from years of systematic investigation. Backup systems ensured that even if authorities raided the apartment, copies of everything would remain safely hidden in data centers across 3 continents. He'd learned from his previous arrests that physical evidence was only as secure as your ability to keep it out of enemy hands. Tonight felt different. As rain drummed against the boarded windows, he'd covered them himself for security reasons. Elias's automated scanners detected something unusual. The software he'd written monitored thousands of government servers simultaneously, looking for anomalous data signatures that might indicate classified information stored in supposedly routine systems. Most alerts were false positives, but after years of refinement, his algorithms had learned to distinguish between genuine anomalies and random digital noise. This particular signal was trying too hard to look ordinary, which was exactly what made it suspicious. A government proxy server deep within the Department of Homeland Security's network infrastructure was handling traffic patterns that didn't match any known legitimate use. The data packets were the right size and frequency to appear routine, but they carried encryption signatures that suggested military-grade security protecting something far more sensitive than typical administrative communications. Most hackers would have dismissed it as a honeypot, a trap designed to lure in digital intruders, but Elias had learned to read between the digital lines over years of careful observation. This signal felt different, older, like it had been running for decades without anyone paying attention to what it was actually protecting. He leaned back in his chair, cracking his knuckles with the deliberate ritual of a surgeon preparing for a complex operation. The proxy was 3 layers deep in government infrastructure, protected by military-grade encryption that would take months to crack through conventional means. But Elias had developed unconventional means over the years. His fingers resumed their dance, this time with the measured precision of a master pianist performing a familiar concerto. Code flowed across his screens like poetry written in 1s and 0s, each line bringing him closer to whatever lay hidden in the digital vault. As the final encryption layer crumbled at 3:47 a.m, Elias held his breath. The archive that materialized before him contained terabytes of data, but it was the file structure that made his pulse quicken. Everything was organized with the kind of meticulous care reserved for the most sensitive operations. Categorical folders with cryptic names like cultural implementation, behavioral modification, and asset management. He opened the first file and the world as he understood it began to unravel. The contracts appeared first, hundreds of them, stretching back decades like a paper trail through the shadow history of American culture. Entertainment companies, advertising agencies, record labels, movie studios, television networks, and news corporations all bound by identical non-disclosure agreements that ran to thousands of pages each. The legal language was deliberately obscure, buried in terminology that would confuse even experienced corporate lawyers who specialized in media contracts. But Elias had taught himself to decode legal doublespeak during his prison sentence, spending countless hours in the law library learning how power structures protected themselves through linguistic camouflage. Each contract referenced cultural programming initiatives and synchronized messaging protocols, with payment structures that dwarfed typical entertainment industry deals. Millions of dollars flowing to seemingly random projects, indie films that barely recouped production costs, music albums that never charted, advertising campaigns for products that didn't seem to exist. All payments were approved by a shell company called Apex Cultural Dynamics, whose corporate registration traced through a labyrinthine network of offshore entities. Elias followed the money trail through banks in Switzerland, shell corporations in the Cayman Islands, trust funds in Luxembourg, and holding companies in jurisdictions he'd never heard of. Every lead ultimately vanished into legal structures so complex they seemed designed more for obfuscation than profit. The internal memos were more revealing, written in the casual tone of executives who felt completely secure in their communications. Corporate leaders from supposedly competing companies discussed narrative adjustments and public sentiment cultivation, like weather forecasters predicting next week's conditions. One memo from a major news network's CEO, dated just 6 months ago, read, "Per our discussion with ACD representatives, the upcoming election cycle requires a 15% increase in anxiety-inducing content during primetime hours. Latest psychological impact studies suggest optimal effectiveness when paired with consumer advertising for comfort products and security solutions." Another memo from a streaming entertainment company outlined specific quotas. Q3 targets include 40% increase in dystopian future programming, 25% increase in surveillance state normalization themes, an introduction of transhumanist concepts through minimum of 12 original series. Demographic targeting should focus on the 18 to 34 age range for maximum long-term conditioning effectiveness. The coordination between supposedly independent media companies was breathtaking in scope. Competing networks shared detailed viewer psychological profiles, coordinated their news coverage to maximize specific emotional responses, and even synchronized their entertainment programming to reinforce particular worldviews. The memos discussed marketing research into subliminal messaging techniques, optimal timing for narrative reinforcement, and methods for making propaganda indistinguishable from organic cultural trends. Video stills scattered throughout the files showed meetings in nondescript conference rooms. Faces were often obscured, but the visible details painted a chilling picture. Executives from competing companies sitting side by side, reviewing presentations with titles like Mass Behavioral Prediction Models and Subliminal Integration Techniques. But it was the symbols that made Elias's blood run cold. They appeared everywhere, in corporate logos embedded in document headers, even watermarked into video files. The all-seeing eye perched atop pyramids, numerical sequences that corresponded to occult traditions, and geometric patterns that seemed random until viewed through the lens of esoteric knowledge. As dawn broke unnoticed outside his boarded windows, Elias began constructing his theory. The Illuminati weren't just folklore, they were real, organised, and operating in plain sight. Rather than ruling through force or political manipulation, they had evolved into something far more sophisticated. Cultural engineers who shaped reality through the careful manipulation of information and entertainment. The fragments suggested a coordinated effort spanning decades. Movies that promoted specific worldviews, music that carried subliminal messages, news coverage that guided public opinion toward predetermined conclusions. Every major cultural event seemed to serve a purpose beyond mere profit or entertainment. Elias created a new encrypted partition on his most secure drive and began organising the evidence. Each piece of the puzzle revealed new connections, new layers of coordination that defied conventional understanding of how media and culture operated. The scope was breathtaking and terrifying, but this was just the first door. As he prepared to dive deeper into the archive, a notification appeared on his screen. New files were uploading automatically to the server, added in real time from sources around the globe. The conspiracy wasn't just historical, it was happening now, every day, with machine-like precision. Elias smiled grimly and opened another energy drink. He had work to do. 3 days of continuous analysis revealed patterns so pervasive they defied coincidence. Elias's custom data mining algorithms had processed thousands of hours of Super Bowl halftime shows, major film releases, top-charting music, and primetime television programming, cross-referencing them with the archived documents he'd discovered. His software compared visual elements, audio frequencies, narrative structures, and symbolic content with mathematical precision that human observation alone could never achieve. The results were undeniable and terrifying. Every major halftime show since 2005 contained specific visual elements that served purposes beyond entertainment. Choreographed movements formed geometric patterns when viewed from aerial cameras, patterns that matched sacred geometry principles known to influence human consciousness. Lighting sequences pulsed at precisely calibrated frequencies, 10 Hz to induce alpha brain states associated with relaxation and suggestibility, 40 Hz bursts to trigger gamma waves linked to heightened emotional responses, and infrasound frequencies below human hearing that created subliminal anxiety responses. The costume designs weren't random fashion choices. They incorporated symbols from the archived files with mathematical precision. Ancient Egyptian imagery, Masonic symbols, occult numerology, but presented in ways that bypassed conscious recognition. The performers themselves were likely unaware of the deeper significance, but the production companies certainly understood every detail. Internal emails discussed symbolic integration quotas and archetypal reinforcement targets with the clinical precision of pharmaceutical dosing guidelines. Hollywood's role was even more sophisticated, operating as a vast conditioning apparatus disguised as entertainment. Elias discovered that blockbuster films weren't just profitable products. They were psychological programming exercises designed to shift public consciousness over decades. Action movies systematically normalized surveillance states, extrajudicial violence, and the acceptability of authoritarian responses to perceived threats. Romantic comedies promoted specific relationship models that prioritize consumption, instant gratification, and emotional instability over lasting partnership and family formation. Science fiction films served as perhaps the most insidious tool of all. They introduced technological and social concepts years before their real-world implementation, ensuring public acceptance when they finally emerged. Movies about neural implants preceded actual brain-computer interface development by exactly the time needed for audience conditioning. Films depicting cashless societies appeared precisely when digital currency infrastructure was being developed. Dystopian scenarios were presented as cautionary tales, while simultaneously making the depicted futures seem inevitable and acceptable. The music industry operated as the most direct delivery system for repetitive psychological messaging. Elias's analysis revealed that hit songs across all genres shared common structural elements designed to trigger specific neurological responses. Repetitive hooks created obsessive thought patterns, bass frequencies induced physical arousal responses, and lyrical themes consistently promoted materialism, emotional chaos, instant gratification, and distrust of traditional social bonds. Chart success wasn't organic. It was engineered through coordinated promotion campaigns that used psychological manipulation techniques, refined through decades of marketing research. Record companies employed neuroscience consultants who designed songs to be literally addictive, triggering dopamine responses that created compulsive listening behaviors. The most successful artists weren't necessarily the most talented. They were the most effective delivery vehicles for predetermined psychological content. But the most chilling discovery came when Elias cross-referenced celebrity deaths with financial markets and policy implementations, using algorithms that could detect correlations across vast datasets that human analysis would miss. The patterns were subtle but statistically undeniable. Whenever a particularly influential public figure died under questionable circumstances, the news cycle would shift dramatically within hours. Public attention would focus intensely on mourning and memorial coverage, while significant legislation passed through Congress, with minimal scrutiny or public debate. Michael Jackson's death had coincided with the most controversial aspects of healthcare reform debates, providing a massive distraction precisely when public opposition was reaching critical mass. Whitney Houston's demise dominated headlines during crucial banking regulation discussions that would have reshaped Wall Street oversight. Prince's passing created a week-long media obsession that completely buried coverage of surveillance law expansions that civil liberties groups had been fighting for months. Each event generated exactly the right emotional state to facilitate predetermined political outcomes. The deaths created collective grief that made the public more passive and receptive to authority, while the intensive media coverage consumed the attention bandwidth that might otherwise have focused on policy changes. The timing wasn't coincidental, it was orchestrated with mathematical precision. Elias found evidence suggesting that some celebrity deaths might have been actively induced rather than simply exploited. Medical records showed unusual patterns of prescription drug interactions. Security camera footage from crucial moments was consistently corrupted or missing, and autopsy results often contained anomalies that suggested external intervention. The pattern was consistent across dozens of cases spanning 3 decades. But even more disturbing was the systematic cultivation of celebrity instability. Internal documents from talent agencies and record companies outlined deliberate strategies for creating psychological dependence, drug addiction, and emotional instability in their most valuable assets. The goal wasn't profit maximization, it was creating performers who could be easily manipulated and, when necessary, destroyed at moments that served larger political purposes. The conspiracy had weaponized celebrity worship itself, turning the public's emotional investment in famous figures into a tool for mass psychological manipulation. Every death became a ritual that renewed the collective trauma bonding between citizens and their media-created gods, making the population more dependent on external authority figures and less capable of independent critical thinking. Elias created a digital conspiracy board on his largest monitor, a sprawling network of connections that would have impressed investigative agencies worldwide if they hadn't been complicit in the system he was mapping. Red lines linked entertainment companies to intelligence agencies through shared personnel, financial investments, and operational coordination. Blue lines traced money flows through the labyrinthine network of shell corporations, revealing how massive sums moved between seemingly unrelated organizations. Green lines mapped the precise timing of cultural events to policy implementations, showing correlation patterns that achieved statistical significance far beyond chance. The board revealed the Illuminati's true genius. They had weaponized human attention itself, transforming consciousness into a battlefield where wars were fought through carefully orchestrated information campaigns. In an age of information overload, controlling what people focused on had become more valuable than controlling what they thought. Distraction had evolved into the ultimate form of mind control, more effective than physical force because victims participated willingly in their own manipulation. The scope was breathtaking and terrifying. Every major cultural trend of the past 30 years could be traced back to deliberate manipulation, orchestrated through the entertainment media complex. Fashion cycles that promoted specific body images and consumption behaviours. Social media trends that encouraged narcissistic self-documentation and reduced attention spans. Political movements that channeled genuine grievances into harmless symbolic protests that changed nothing. Even conspiracy theories themselves appeared to be guided phenomena, designed to discredit legitimate questioning by associating it with obviously false claims. As Elias studied his creation through bloodshot eyes that hadn't seen natural light in days, a pattern emerged that made him question everything he thought he knew about free will and human autonomy. The manipulation wasn't just cultural, it was neurological. The constant stream of engineered content was literally rewiring human brains on a species level, creating generations of people whose thoughts and desires had been shaped by external forces since birth. The evidence suggested that the traditional concept of individual choice had become largely illusory. In a world where every piece of information was filtered through manipulated channels, where every cultural touchstone carried hidden programming, where every social trend was artificially generated, what did it mean to make an independent decision? The conspiracy had achieved something more insidious than totalitarianism. They had created voluntary slavery disguised as freedom of choice. As Elias studied his creation, a pattern emerged that made him question everything he thought he knew about free will. Every major cultural trend of the past 30 years could be traced back to deliberate manipulation. Fashion cycles, social media behaviours, political movements, even conspiracy theories, all potentially guided by the same hidden hand. The realization struck him like a physical blow. If they could control culture so completely, how could he be certain his own obsession with finding them wasn't part of their plan? The media conglomerate's server proved surprisingly easy to penetrate, which should have been Elias's first warning. Titan Communications owned 17 major news networks, 43 radio stations, controlling interests in 12 social media platforms, and content distribution deals with virtually every major streaming service. Their annual revenue exceeded the GDP of most small nations, and their influence over global information flow was effectively unparalleled in human history. Their security should have been impenetrable. Military contractors protected their networks. They employed former NSA specialists as cybersecurity consultants, and their server farms were housed in facilities that rivaled government installations. Yet Elias's intrusion tools sliced through their defences like a hot knife through butter, encountering minimal resistance and no countermeasures. It was almost as if they wanted him inside their systems. The internal documents were even more damning than the government archive, revealing coordination that made wartime propaganda efforts look amateur by comparison. Daily emails outlined narrative priorities for each news cycle, complete with psychological impact assessments, demographic targeting strategies, and measurable public sentiment targets. The language was coldly clinical, reducing human emotion and belief to data points on quarterly performance spreadsheets. Editorial meetings were recorded and transcribed with military precision. News directors from supposedly competing networks participated in weekly coordination calls, where they discussed upcoming stories, agreed on messaging frameworks, and divided coverage responsibilities to ensure comprehensive narrative saturation. The goal wasn't profit, it was behavioural modification on a civilizational scale. One particularly chilling document was titled MK-Ultra Evolution, Modern Behavioural Modification Through Repetitive Exposure. It outlined techniques that made the CIA's infamous mind control experiments look primitive and inefficient by comparison. Rather than targeting individuals through drugs and trauma, the new methods focused on mass psychological conditioning through carefully orchestrated media campaigns that operated below the threshold of conscious awareness. The manual explained in disturbing detail how repetitive exposure to specific imagery, sound frequencies, narrative structures, and emotional triggers could alter brain chemistry over extended periods. Citizens weren't being brainwashed in the traditional sense. They were being neurologically rewired through their daily media consumption, with changes that accumulated gradually over years and decades. The process was so subtle and pervasive that victims never realized their thoughts weren't entirely their own. Predictive programming emerged as a central technique in their arsenal. By introducing concepts, technologies, and social changes through fictional entertainment, before implementing them in reality, the manipulators could bypass critical thinking entirely. Audiences would unconsciously accept new surveillance technologies, social norms, and political systems, because they had been psychologically prepared through years of entertainment conditioning that made the changes feel familiar and inevitable. The technique was devastatingly effective because it exploited fundamental aspects of human psychology. People naturally accepted ideas they had encountered multiple times, even if the initial exposure came through obviously fictional sources. The brain treated repeated fictional scenarios as potential realities, creating neural pathways that made actual implementation feel like a natural progression rather than a radical change. The financial section revealed the true scope of the operation. Trillions of dollars flowed through the network annually, dwarfing the budgets of most nations. The money came from unexpected sources: pension funds, insurance companies, even charitable foundations unknowingly contributed to the conspiracy through complex investment structures. But the most disturbing discovery was the coordination between intelligence agencies, banking institutions, entertainment corporations, and technology companies, operating as a unified organism despite their apparent competition and conflicting interests. Weekly video conferences brought together representatives from the CIA, Federal Reserve, major studios, social media platforms, and multinational technology corporations. They discussed sentiment management and narrative synchronization with the casual professionalism of corporate executives planning quarterly sales targets. The recordings revealed a shadow government that operated through corporate proxies rather than official political channels. Traditional governmental power had been largely superseded by a network of private organizations that could implement policy through market manipulation and cultural conditioning without the messy inconvenience of democratic oversight. Elections still occurred, but they had become elaborate theatre productions designed to maintain the illusion of popular sovereignty, while real decisions were made in boardrooms that the public never saw. News cycles weren't random or market-driven. They were orchestrated months in advance by committees that included intelligence operatives, banking executives, media moguls, and technology leaders. Wars provided distraction from economic manipulation while generating massive profits for defence contractors. Celebrity scandals offered convenient cover for political corruption investigations. Natural disasters created opportunities to implement emergency powers that somehow always became permanent fixtures of the expanded surveillance state. Every major event served multiple purposes in a grand design that stretched across decades. The 2008 financial crisis had been engineered to consolidate banking power while conditioning the public to accept bailouts as normal economic policy. The COVID-19 pandemic had accelerated digital transformation initiatives while normalising remote monitoring and social isolation. Climate change narratives were being used to justify energy sector reorganisation and carbon credit markets that would generate enormous profits for the same financial institutions that had caused previous economic crises. Elias found recorded conversations between news anchors and their handlers that destroyed any remaining illusion about journalistic integrity. Popular television personalities who projected authority and trustworthiness were revealed as knowing participants in psychological manipulation campaigns, carefully crafting emotional triggers with the precision of weapons designers. They discussed techniques for inducing specific brain states in viewers, optimal timing for fear-based messaging, and methods for making propaganda indistinguishable from legitimate news reporting. The most chilling recordings involved discussions of population control strategies disguised as public health initiatives. Representatives from pharmaceutical companies, government health agencies, and media corporations coordinated messaging campaigns designed to promote dependency on medical interventions while discouraging natural immunity and traditional healing practices. The goal wasn't public health. It was creating a population that required constant pharmaceutical management to function normally. Mental health treatment had been weaponized through carefully designed chemical interventions that didn't cure underlying problems but created permanent pharmaceutical dependencies. Educational systems were being restructured to produce workers who could follow complex instructions but lacked the critical thinking skills to question authority. Even exercise and nutrition guidelines were manipulated to ensure that optimal physical and mental health remained just out of reach for the general population. The evidence was overwhelming, but as Elias prepared to copy the files to his secure drives, an error message appeared. Access denied. User privileges revoked. The server was locking him out in real time, which meant someone was actively monitoring his intrusion. He worked frantically to extract what data he could, but the digital walls were closing in. As the connection terminated, one final document appeared briefly on his screen. A personnel file with his photograph in the header Asset Management, Elias Corin, Status, Active Monitoring. The file vanished before he could read it completely, but the implications were clear. They knew he was coming. Desperation drove Elias deeper into the network than he had ever dared venture. Using techniques that bordered on digital necromancy, he resurrected connection pathways that should have been impossible to access. The risk was enormous. Each probe left digital fingerprints that could lead authorities directly to his door. But the glimpse of his own file had transformed his quest from curiosity to survival. The recordings he discovered in the deepest server vaults were audio files from meetings that shouldn't have existed, according to any official record. High-definition audio captured conversations between intelligence officials, Federal Reserve board members, entertainment executives, technology billionaires, pharmaceutical industry leaders, and representatives from organizations he'd never heard of, but whose influence seemed to span continents. They discussed the future of human consciousness like generals planning military campaigns against an enemy population. The meetings followed a rigid schedule. Every third Wednesday of each month, participants would gather in a location identified only as the facility to review progress on what they called the Integration Project. The audio quality suggested advanced surveillance equipment, possibly indicating that someone within their organization was documenting everything for purposes that remained unclear. One recording from a meeting dated 6 months ago made his blood freeze in his veins. Phase 7, implementation has exceeded all projections, reported a woman's voice that analysis software identified as belonging to a major pharmaceutical company executive. Antidepressant dependency rates have reached 23% of the adult population in target demographics. Cognitive function degradation is proceeding on schedule, with marked decreases in long-term planning abilities and resistance to authority structures. Another voice, male with a distinctive southern accent. The cryptocurrency infrastructure is approaching full readiness for behavioral tracking integration. Once we achieve real-time monitoring of every financial transaction, thought control becomes mathematically precise. Every purchase will inform our psychological profiles. Every payment will be subject to conditional approval based on compliance metrics. Money itself becomes the ultimate surveillance and control mechanism. A third voice, older and carrying unmistakable authority. Excellent progress. The entertainment division reports successful integration of transhumanist themes across all major platforms. Public acceptance of neural interface technology has increased 23% since the campaign began, with particularly strong adoption rates among the 18 to 34 demographic. We're ready for beta testing in select metropolitan markets next quarter. The conversations continued for hours, revealing a surveillance state that made Orwell's 1984 look like a children's story. They weren't just watching citizens, they were psychologically profiling entire populations in real time, predicting dissent before it emerged, and neutralizing threats through targeted manipulation rather than direct confrontation. The system was so sophisticated that most people would never realize they were living under complete psychological control. The integration project appeared to be the culmination of decades of research into human behavior modification. Rather than controlling people through force or obvious propaganda, they had created a system that guided human decision-making through carefully crafted environmental pressures. Every choice citizens made was influenced by factors they never recognized as external manipulation, creating the illusion of free will while ensuring predetermined outcomes. Food additives that affected brain chemistry, architectural designs that induced specific emotional states, lighting frequencies that influence circadian rhythms, sound pollution calibrated to create chronic stress. Every aspect of modern life had been optimized to create psychological conditions that made populations easier to manage. The genius was that victims participated willingly in their own subjugation, often defending the very systems that enslaved them. The Watcher Protocol emerged as their most sophisticated tool. Rather than silencing conspiracy theorists and dissidents, they monitored them continuously, studying their methods and psychology. The data was used to identify others with similar thinking patterns, creating detailed maps of potential resistance before it could organize effectively. But the most chilling revelation was their approach to handling discovered threats. They didn't assassinate or imprison troublesome individuals, they drove them insane. Subtle psychological pressure, engineered coincidences, and carefully orchestrated personal tragedies would destroy a person's credibility and mental stability. Victims became their own worst enemies, discrediting themselves more effectively than any external force could. Elias found case studies documenting the destruction of dozens of individuals who had gotten too close to the truth. Journalists who suffered sudden career implosions, researchers who developed inexplicable mental health problems, hackers who became paranoid and unstable. The pattern was consistent. Initial discovery, followed by escalating pressure until the subject either retreated into obscurity or self-destructed publicly. As he absorbed this information, strange coincidences began occurring in his own life. His internet connection inexplicably slowed at crucial moments. Phone calls developed electronic interference. His food delivery orders were mysteriously cancelled or delayed. Each incident was minor and easily dismissed as random bad luck, but the cumulative effect was unmistakable. Someone was watching. Elias tried to dismiss his growing paranoia as a natural reaction to the disturbing information he was processing. But late at night, when the city was quiet and his monitors provided the only light, he sometimes heard footsteps in the hallway outside his apartment. They would pause at his door for exactly 30 seconds before continuing down the corridor. The recordings had mentioned something else, something that made his hands shake as he worked. Subject 347 shows exceptional pattern recognition abilities. Psychological profile suggests high probability of success in reaching final verification stage. Recommend maintaining current stimuli until extraction protocols can be implemented. He had no way of knowing for certain, but the timing suggested a horrible possibility. He might be Subject 347. The decision to leak his findings publicly felt like stepping off a cliff. Elias had accumulated enough evidence to expose a conspiracy that dwarfed anything in human history, but he knew that releasing it would likely cost him his life, or worse, his sanity. Yet the alternative was remaining silent while humanity sleepwalked toward a digital totalitarianism that would make physical oppression obsolete. He began by seeding information across the dark web's most secure forums, using identity masking techniques that should have made him untraceable. The posts were carefully crafted to appear as random discoveries by different users, avoiding the pattern recognition algorithms that monitored conspiracy communities. Each fragment of evidence was real but incomplete, requiring readers to connect the dots themselves. The response was immediate and disturbing. His posts gained traction quickly, too quickly. Within hours, they were being shared across platforms, analysed by citizen journalists, and discussed in mainstream media as examples of dangerous misinformation. The speed of the reaction suggested a coordinated response, as if the revelation had been anticipated and prepared for in advance. More troubling was the nature of the responses. While some users took the evidence seriously, others immediately began discrediting it with arguments that seemed too sophisticated to be spontaneous. They pointed to technical inconsistencies that Elias was certain didn't exist, questioned source authenticity with forensic expertise that suggested professional training, and redirected discussions toward harmless tangents that neutered the information's impact. Within days, his revelations were being treated as another internet conspiracy theory, filed alongside flat earth theories and lizard people claims. The evidence was dismissed not through logical refutation, but through association with obviously false ideas, a technique the archived documents had called cognitive contamination. As the online discussions evolved, Elias realized he was watching a masterpiece of psychological manipulation in real time. The truth was being buried not through censorship, but through calculated flooding with disinformation. His genuine evidence was drowning in a sea of deliberate nonsense, making it impossible for reasonable people to distinguish fact from fantasy. But the digital warfare was only the beginning. Physical reality began shifting around him in subtle but unmistakable ways. His internet speed slowed to a crawl whenever he tried to upload new evidence. Delivery services could no longer find his address. His phone developed a mysterious static that made conversations nearly impossible. Even his electricity began fluctuating at random intervals, causing his equipment to crash at the most inconvenient moments. The psychological pressure was more sophisticated than anything he had imagined from the case studies. Rather than obvious intimidation, he faced a constant series of minor inconveniences and technical failures that could be dismissed as coincidence by anyone who wasn't experiencing them directly. The effect was maddening, literally. He began questioning his own perceptions, wondering if paranoia was making him see patterns that didn't exist. Sleep became elusive as his apartment filled with unexplained sounds. Electronics hummed at frequencies that seemed designed to prevent rest. The heating system cycled erratically, creating temperature fluctuations that made comfort impossible. Water pressure dropped whenever he tried to shower, and his refrigerator developed a whine that stopped only when he was away from his computer. Friends and family members began expressing concern about his mental state, though he couldn't remember telling them about his research. They called with surprising frequency, all using similar language about the importance of seeking help and taking breaks from the computer. The conversations felt scripted, as if his loved ones were reading from prepared statements. As days blended into a haze of technical failures and social pressure, Elias realized he was living inside one of the case studies he'd discovered. They weren't just monitoring him, they were actively dismantling his life with surgical precision. But unlike the previous victims, he knew what was happening. That knowledge might be his only chance of survival. He had to reach the final layer of the archive before they completed their psychological destruction. If his theory was correct, the deepest files would contain the ultimate revelation, and possibly his salvation. The final server required every technique Elias had learned over 2 decades of hacking, protected by quantum encryption and guarded by AI systems that adapted to his intrusion attempts in real time. It represented the pinnacle of digital security. Yet as he worked through the night, fueled by desperation and the last of his energy drinks, the barriers fell with almost suspicious ease. The locked folder contained exactly what he had expected and feared: complete dossiers on hundreds of individuals, including himself. His file was massive, containing information that should have been impossible to collect. Screenshots of every computer session going back years, audio recordings from devices that shouldn't have had microphones, even biometric data tracking his health and emotional states in real time. But it was the analysis that truly horrified him. Psychological profiles predicted his behaviour with uncanny accuracy, mapping his personality down to neurological quirks that he had never shared with anyone. The files detailed his childhood trauma, relationship patterns, cognitive biases, and emotional triggers with clinical precision. They knew him better than he knew himself. The surveillance had begun long before his current investigation. Webcam captures showed him staring at monitors in his apartment, taken from angles that suggested multiple hidden cameras. Phone conversations with friends and family had been recorded and analysed for stress patterns and emotional manipulation opportunities. Even his online shopping habits, medical records, and financial transactions had been fed into behavioural prediction algorithms. Most disturbing was the timeline. The earliest entries in his file dated back 15 years, to when he had first begun investigating conspiracy theories as a college student. They hadn't just discovered his activities, they had been watching and shaping them from the beginning. Every major breakthrough in his hacking skills, every connection he had made in underground communities, every piece of evidence he'd uncovered, all had been carefully orchestrated. The documents revealed the true scope of his manipulation. The pharmaceutical company he had exposed years earlier, the leaked documents had been strategically placed for him to find. The wrongful arrest that had cost him his fortune, engineered to isolate him and fuel his paranoia. Even his current apartment had been selected for him, the basement location perfect for the psychological pressure techniques they planned to employ, but the most shattering revelation was still to come. As he scrolled through terabytes of personal data, a video file caught his attention. The timestamp showed it was recorded 3 days ago, the night he had first accessed the government server. The video showed him working at his computer, but the angle was impossible. The camera had to be inside his monitor, watching him as he discovered the conspiracy. He was staring at footage of himself reading about his own surveillance. The video continued, showing him creating his digital conspiracy board, making connections between entertainment companies and intelligence agencies, even the moment when he had first seen his own photograph in the corporate files. But there was something else, a timestamp in the corner that made no sense. According to the file properties, the video had been created 6 months before it was allegedly recorded. His hand shaking, Elias cross-referenced the timestamp with other files in his dossier. The pattern that emerged destroyed everything he thought he knew about his investigation. Every revelation, every breakthrough, every piece of evidence he had discovered, all had been prepared in advance. The conspiracy he had uncovered was real, but his discovery of it had been choreographed down to the minute. They hadn't just been watching him, they had been directing him, feeding him information at precisely calculated intervals, allowing him to feel the satisfaction of discovery while ensuring he found only what they wanted him to find. His entire investigation was a performance, and he had been playing his role perfectly. The sound of footsteps in the hallway outside his apartment was no longer mysterious. It was his cue that the final act was about to begin. The timestamp that shattered Elias's world appeared in a routine system log, buried among thousands of other entries he might have overlooked in his haste to process the overwhelming data. But his pattern recognition skills, honed by decades of digital archaeology, caught the anomaly immediately. His surveillance file had been created 3 years before, He had even begun his serious investigation into secret societies, not updated, not modified, created. The implications spread through his mind like digital wildfire. Every forum post that had sparked his interest, every breadcrumb of evidence he had followed, every contact who had guided him toward new information sources, all had been carefully planted elements in an elaborate psychological experiment. He wasn't hunting the Illuminati. He was their laboratory rat, navigating a maze they had constructed specifically for him. The files reveal the true scope of the operation. Project Cassandra aimed to study how individuals with specific psychological profiles could be guided toward predetermined conclusions while believing they were conducting independent research. Elias was test subject 347 in a series that had already processed thousands of potential dissidents, conspiracy theorists, and amateur investigators. The methodology was diabolical in its sophistication. Rather than suppressing information, they had created controlled leaks that satisfied the subject's desire for hidden truth, while ensuring that any revelations served their ultimate purposes. Every conspiracy theorist who believed they had uncovered secret plots was actually participating in a massive behavioural study that helped refine mass manipulation techniques. But Project Cassandra served another purpose, creating the perfect patsies. When subjects like Elias inevitably attempted to share their discoveries, the public would dismiss them as delusional paranoids. The conspiracy theorists discredited themselves more effectively than any government censorship could, providing cover for the real operations happening in plain sight. The genius was circular. They used genuine conspiracies to hide their conspiracy, to create conspiracy theories. The Ouroboros of manipulation consumed its own tail while strengthening the head. Elias found video recordings of planning meetings where researchers discussed his psychological profile like entomologists studying an insect. His obsessive personality, his need for validation through intellectual superiority, his isolation and distrust of mainstream society, all were noted as advantageous traits for the experiment. They had identified him as an ideal subject before he had even begun his journey into the digital underground. The recordings were clinical in their detachment. Subject 347 shows exceptional persistence and pattern recognition abilities. Recommend accelerating the revelation timeline to achieve maximum psychological impact. His technical skills allow for more sophisticated evidence plants than previous subjects. Agreed. The deep web forums are seeded and ready. Will allow him to discover the entertainment industry connections next week, followed by the financial networks the following month. Estimated timeline to complete breakdown, 6 to 8 months. What about extraction? Standard protocol. Once he achieves full paranoid state, we'll activate the final revelation. The cognitive dissonance should ensure complete psychological collapse within 72 hours. Subject will either retreat into catatonic withdrawal or self-eliminate. Either outcome serves project goals. The footsteps outside his door had stopped. In the silence that followed, Elias could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears like a countdown timer. Every shadow in his peripheral vision might be a hidden observer. Every electronic device could be a surveillance tool. Even his own thoughts felt compromised, infected by the knowledge that his mind had been invaded and mapped by researchers who understood his psychology better than he did. But as despair threatened to overwhelm him completely, a final realization emerged from the chaos of his collapsing worldview. If they had created all of this as an experiment, if his investigation was a carefully orchestrated performance, then the evidence he had found might be real after all. They couldn't manipulate him with fake conspiracies. They had to use genuine ones to make the manipulation believable. The entertainment industry coordination, the financial manipulation, the psychological conditioning of entire populations, it was all real. His discovery of it might have been staged, but the conspiracy itself existed exactly as he had uncovered it. They had made one critical error in their psychological experiment. They had given him access to the truth. The question was whether that knowledge could serve any purpose now that he understood his role as an unwitting puppet. As the footsteps resumed outside his door, moving with deliberate slowness toward his apartment, Elias realized he had perhaps minutes to decide how this story would end. He could retreat into madness as they expected, becoming another cautionary tale about the dangers of conspiracy thinking. He could attempt to fight back, though they had mapped every aspect of his psychology and would anticipate any strategy he might devise. Or he could find a third option, something they hadn't planned for because it lay outside their understanding of his character. The gentle knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. A voice, polite and professional, spoke through the thin wood. "Mr. Corrin, we need to talk." Elias looked at his screens one final time, at the conspiracy board that had consumed his life, at the evidence that proved humanity was being manipulated on a scale beyond historical precedent. Then he looked at his reflection in the dark monitor, the face of a man who had discovered that his greatest fear and greatest hope were the same thing. He had found the truth. The truth had been carefully crafted to find him. But perhaps, in that circular dance of manipulation and discovery, lay an opportunity that neither he nor his watchers had anticipated. After all, even the most sophisticated psychological experiment could produce unexpected results. As he reached for the door handle, Elias Corrin smiled for the first time in months. If they had taught him anything, it was that reality was far more malleable than most people believed. And if reality could be shaped, then perhaps it was time for the subject to become the experimenter. The door opened to reveal figures in dark suits, their faces professional masks hiding whatever emotions they might have felt. But as they looked into Elias's eyes, something shifted in their expressions, a flicker of uncertainty that suggested their psychological profiles might have missed something crucial about their carefully studied subject. "Gentlemen," Elias said, his voice steady despite the chaos in his mind, "I've been expecting you. Shall we discuss what happens next?" The game was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning.